Chapter 262. It was said that very high places were very cold. Yi Hongyu, the Tao addict, had a very high state. The tens of thousands of Taoist swords that she sprinkled on the lakeside like a rainstorm were also very cold. The swords condensed from the lake water were covered with a light frost and had already become ice. Tens of thousands of ice and frost swords covered the sky above the valley. A dark mass of swords arrived at the lakeside. At this moment, an umbrella flower bloomed in front of the thousands of swords. The flower was as black as the night sky, causing the thousands of swords to pale in comparison. At the critical moment of life and death, Ning Ke opened the big black umbrella. This choice was not unexpected, even like those tired of clichés. However, just like the clichés in articles were often the essence summarized by thousands of years of scholars, the big black umbrella was the same. It could bear the dust of the world and cover the sky. No matter how heavy the rainstorm was, it would not leak a trace. The small but sharp Taoist swords came densely and hit on the thick surface of the big black umbrella like a real rainstorm, making loud and dull sounds of impact. The Taoist swords could not pierce the surface of the umbrella. With the strong impact force, they broke into pieces of ice and then turned into mist and dissipated in front of the black umbrella. While holding the umbrella, Ning Ke pulled Mo Shanshan behind him. The big black umbrella was very big. The two of them half squatted under the umbrella. There seemed to be a semicircular dark night above their heads, leaving no gap. The Taoist swords could not pierce the big black umbrella, but the terrible impact accumulated on the umbrella remained on the surface of the umbrella. Then, along the umbrella handle made of an unknown material, it was transmitted to Ning Ke's hands that were tightly holding the handle. He lowered his head and frowned. His arms kept trembling and his fingers turned pale. He had exhausted all his strength, but still could not resist the strong impact from the surface of the umbrella. Tens of thousands of Taoist swords formed a complicated sword array in the air by the lakeside. They fell in order and bombarded continuously. The speed became faster and faster. Even the ice and frost swords had a bright red tail, as if they were burning. The handle of the big black umbrella slipped from Ning Ke's fingers and hit his chest heavily. Accompanied by a painful groan, blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, but his left hand tightly gripped the middle of the umbrella handle, his right hand tightly gripping the ribs of the black umbrella like iron wire, and his chest pressed against the umbrella handle. The bombardment of the Taoist swords continued, and the power coming from the surface of the big black umbrella grew stronger and stronger. His fingers, which were clinging to the umbrella ribs, were gradually cut and bleeding, and were even about to sink into his fingers. Ning Ke stared at the white bones vaguely visible in the bloody flesh. His cheeks turned pale because of the severe pain, and even his body began to tremble. However, he still did not intend to let go. He had always been ruthless to himself, especially at critical moments of life and death. Therefore, before the 10,000 Taoist swords by the lake, he would not let go of the black umbrella, because he knew that once he let go, both he and Mo Shanshan would die. The blood flowing from his broken fingers did not drip to the ground, but flowed along the ribs of the black umbrella to the surface of the umbrella. Suddenly, a light appeared in his sense of perception. Unfortunately, at this moment, he really had no energy to find the true appearance of the light. He could only stare at the black surface of the umbrella, hoping that the psyche power of the Tao addict would quickly weaken. After shooting Prince Long Qing, he was very clear that he and the Divine Hall, especially the Tao addict, had become mortal enemies. However, his eyes fell on the black umbrella, and he could not help but feel a lot of admiration and admiration. The divine talisman in the brocade bag written by Master Yen Sei himself, the epoch-making primordial 13 arrows that gathered the wisdom and energy of the back of the mountain of the academy, and the calligraphy addict Mo Shanshan, who had already understood half of the divine talisman. What kind of power was this? Although the Tao addict had entered the knowing destiny state on the snow cliff, if she were an ordinary grand cultivator in the initial stage of the knowing destiny state, such a power and Ning Kei's hidden dangerous means would probably kill her on the spot. In the face of Ning Kei and Mo Shanshan's hidden dangerous means, she would also die on the spot. However, the Tao addict did not die. Although she was seriously injured by the 2 talisman arrows, this crazy Tao addict did not die after all. Not only did she not die, but she indifferently stood on the thin ice of the lake. Being bound by the divine talisman of binding, she gave up the most precious natal item and used 10,000 Taoist swords to suppress Ning Kei and Mo Shanshan so that they could not fight back. Ning Kei once heard that the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace once praised the Tao addict for being proficient in all kinds of methods. Now it seemed that it was true. The Tao addict was not only in a high state, but also in her perseverance, determination, vision, and endless means in the battle. He could not help but think, even so, I can't kill you. It seems that I have to find a way to kill you. Although it was not launched by the talisman master himself, so the talisman of binding on the Daming Lake lost some of its magic, it was a divine talisman written by Master Yen Sei after all. Its talisman power lasted for a long time and was very strong. Even Yi Hongyu, the Tao addict, could not get rid of it in a short time. Her white shoulder was shot by the primordial 13 arrows again. The blood condensed into blood beads and clung to her bare upper arm. It was a little bloody. Her meticulous and solemn Taoist bun had long been messed up. When strands of black hair floated in the air, they were tied to her cheeks by the binding talisman. The black hair against her white skin made her look particularly beautiful, but also a little embarrassed. But there was no expression on the Tao addict's face. She just coldly looked at the big black umbrella by the lake. As a core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, he was so weak. The academy appointed Ning Kei to represent the back mountain to travel around the world, so he must have some life-saving means. Therefore, although she sighed at the strong defense ability of the big black umbrella, she was not surprised. What really surprised her and even faintly admired Ning Kei was the ability he showed in the battle. This ability did not refer to the state or the degree of control of the breath of heaven and earth, but referred to the ingenious use of all the fighting means and the accurate choice of timing. It could even be called a kind of temperament. Today, in order to kill Ning Kei by the Daming Lake, she had tried 90% of her efforts. She rarely used the Haotian divine skill, which she had not been comprehending for a long time. Finally, she used the Taoism law of the Wanjian sect, which shocked the world by the hierarch of the Haotian Taoism sect. However, she still could not kill him. Instead, she was seriously injured by him. The miserable wound on her shoulder, the slightly warm blood in her palm, and the blood beads on her upper arm all made Yi Hongyu feel angry, humiliated, and even crazy. But her eyes began to burn like the swords formed by the frozen water scales, revealing a fanatical coldness. Only when facing an opponent who was truly worthy of respect would such a look appear. In order to prove her Tao, she searched for powerhouses on the Peach Mountain of West Hill and searched for the descendants in the wilderness of the world. Over the years, she had fought with many powerhouses, but very few of them could win her respect and even admiration. Because in her view, those so-called powerhouses only had the state and powerful strength, but did not know how to use them. They were as worthless as pedantic scholars. Until today, she met Ning Kei and found that the weakest world wayfarer in history was an extremely rare cultivator who understood the true meaning of fighting. Although his state was still low, as long as his state improved a little, he would definitely be extremely powerful when proving his Tao by life and death. She was very sure of this inference, because she was such a person. The big black umbrella trembled under the Taoist swords of the rainstorm by the lake. It seemed that it would collapse at any time, but it did not. The water mist that the ice swords turned into became thicker and thicker, and gradually buried it. The Tao addict looked at it expressionlessly, and said very seriously in her heart, "Even this can't kill you? It seems that you really have to die." Yi Hongyu was obsessed with Tao and with proving her Tao. How to prove her Tao? Only life and death, so she fanatically pursued fighting. Ning Ke was obsessed with life and death. Why did he want to die? He could only avoid death. So he fought desperately. Although the reasons were different, the apparent temperament formed was somewhat similar. If they could know each other's childhood, they would probably know that they were the same kind of people. Because they had the same temperament and philosophy, they admired each other and had a deeper desire to kill each other. Because it was not easy to kill, they respected each other and had to kill each other. The Taoist swords attacked the Black Umbrella, and the Black Umbrella resisted the Taoist swords. Standing on the lake, the Tao addict could not move her body, and the wound on her shoulder was still bleeding. She did not know when her psyche power would be exhausted. Hiding under the umbrella, Ning Ke could not move his body, and the wound between his fingers kept bleeding. He did not know when he could not hold the umbrella tightly. As time passed, Yi Hongyu's face was pale, but there was no sign that her psyche power was exhausted. Ning Ke lowered his head and tightly pursed his lips that were pale because of the loss of blood, and there was no sign that he would let go. The battle by the Daming Lake changed from a very intense dynamic picture to an absolute static picture. Except for the sword and the umbrella, the hidden danger was getting more and more intense. As long as one side could not hold on, it would be the time of destruction. The situation seemed to have entered a deadlock. Both of them were so fierce that they could not see the end of this deadlock. It seemed that survival or death could only depend on who could hold on to the end. In this case, a female talisman master seemed to be forgotten. But she was the calligraphy addict, so how could she be forgotten? In fact, the person who finally solved this deadlock was her. Mo Shanshan stood up and stood outside the big black umbrella. Ning Ke was astonished. Looking at the dense Taoist swords coming toward her, the female talisman master calmly bit her finger and let the blood drip from her finger. Then she gently stretched out her finger in the air. With her movement, the Taoist swords stabbing toward her suddenly slowed down a little. The blood dripping from her slender fingertip was strangely suspended in the air. Chapter 263. The ancient aura surged up from the mountain and pierced the gray sky. But it suddenly converged at the moment when it was about to touch the sky. The floating snow on the top of the snow-capped peak flew gradually, and the aura of the verdant valley was in chaos. The strong wind danced wildly in the air and swept everything in a flash. The Tao addict's thousands of ice swords, the calligraphy addict's half-divine talisman, the binding talisman released by Ning Ke crushed the bag, and the boiling lake water were all swallowed up by the wind and disappeared without a trace. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan were directly shaken by the soaring aura. They woke up after a moment of dizziness. Looking at the thick fog covering the sky and the earth, he could not help but feel a little cold. This kind of horrible aura was not like the power that a human could exert. Even a powerhouse at the peak of knowing destiny state could not do this. The quiver and the bag were still beside him. He was shocked and puzzled. This violent aura directly swallowed everything, including the aura of the Tao addict. But why was he still intact and not hurt? What is this talisman? Ning Ke could not suppress the shock in his heart and looked at Mo Shanshan beside him and asked. Mo Shanshan raised her sleeves to wipe the blood dripping from the corner of her mouth and shook her head. Previously, she used her blood as ink to write the half-divine talisman to attack the Daming Lake, which caused the change in the valley. However, it seemed that she did not expect such a result. Listening to the silent surroundings, she found that she could no longer hear the waves of the Daming Lake. There was some lingering fear in her dark eyes. She trembled and said, "It has nothing to do with me." The two supported each other and stood up with difficulty. Their sight was full of mist, and they could not see clearly where they were. Ning Ke did not understand her words and looked at her with an inquiring look. Mo Shanshan coughed slightly and felt the ancient aura still lingering in the thick fog. She said with awe and longing, "This aura is the power released when the front gate array of the Devil's Doctrine is opened. I just tried to open the array, but I did not expect that the power released by opening the array would be so strong." The front gate array of the Devil's Doctrine was opened? Ning Ke was shocked. A few days ago on the snow cliff, Prince Long Qing had said that it would take some time before the front gate of Devil's Doctrine would open. These days, he had been comprehending Tao by the Daming Lake, but he did not feel any signs of the front gate of Devil's Doctrine opening. He did not expect that Mo Shanshan had the ability to see through the big tactical formation of the front gate of Devil's Doctrine and make it open in advance. Thinking of this, he looked at Mo Shanshan with a burning gaze. He thought that the three addicts in the world were indeed worthy of their reputation. Usually, they looked gentle, and there was nothing special about them. However, at the critical moment, they could always bring too many surprises. The calligraphy addict had really reached the realm of the talisman tactical circle. Being stared at by Ning Ke's scorching eyes, Mo Shanshan was not used to the admiration in his eyes. She lowered her head shyly and explained softly, "You have been comprehending Tao and breaking the realm by the lakeside these days, and I have nothing to do. So I have been looking at this front gate tactical array for a long time by the lakeside, so I have understood some things." She lowered her head and continued to whisper, "And this is not the main tactical array, but the hidden tactical array outside the front gate." Although Master Yen Sei had once said that talismans were tactical arrays, and Ning Ke had also been used as a coolie by Seventh Sister to repair the back mountain tactical array of the academy, his knowledge of tactical arrays was still extremely poor, and he did not understand the hidden tactical array at all. However, he was very clear that the situation had fallen into a desperate situation under the attack of the Tao addict, Yi Hongyu. Mo Shanshan opening the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was equivalent to directly breaking the deadlock, which was more important than anything else. Ning Ke sighed with emotion and said, "The Tao addict is really powerful. After entering the knowing destiny state, even you and I together are no match for her. It's a pity that you are here, so the Daming Lake is a wrong battlefield for her." Mo Shanshan raised her head with joy in her eyes. From the frontier fortress of the north of Yen Kingdom to the depths of the wilderness, she always felt that compared with Ning Ke, she was only a calligraphy addict, but did not play much role. She could not help but feel a little sad. At this time, after receiving Ning Ke's praise, she confirmed that she had played a role, so she said softly, "I was just trying." Ning Ke said with a smile, "Excessive modesty is arrogance." Mo Shanshan nodded with a smile. Looking at the thick fog around them, Ning Ke slightly frowned and asked, "What should we do next? If the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine has been opened, how can we get in?" The fog was so thick that it blocked all vision. The chi of heaven and earth was so chaotic that even the sense of perception could only perceive a very chaotic area. In such an environment, he did not even know where he was at this time, let alone find the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Was he still in the verdant valley, or had he been shaken to other places by that aura? Mo Shanshan closed her eyes and stretched her slender fingers out of her cotton sleeves into the fog. She slightly bent her fingers to calculate and perceive. After a moment, she opened her eyes and frowned, saying, "Let's wait for the fog to disperse." There was always time for the fog to disperse. It did not take long before the change in the chi of heaven and earth caused by the opening of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was gradually diluted by the real world. The fog in the air was the first to disperse, and they could vaguely see the high sky. For some reason, the originally gray snow clouds had already dispersed, revealing a corner of the blue sky. The fog dispersed faster and faster. From the blue sky to the snow-capped peak and then to the peak, Ning Ke continuously saw the lush greenery from the blue sky to the snow-capped peak. Looking at the snow-capped peak that he had seen for a few days and the relative position, he was shocked to find that the place where he and Sang Sang were standing it should be the center of the Daming Lake. However, the soles of their feet were clearly touching the ground. How could they be in the lake? Where did the water of the Daming Lake go? If the lake water was directly evaporated by the power of the opening of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, there should be mud under their feet. However, the hard and thick feeling was obviously a little strange. The fog continued to disperse from the sky to the land, and they could already see the green broad-leaved forest by the lake. Looking at the height of the forest, Ning Ke was more and more sure that they were at the bottom of the lake with a lower terrain, and he became more and more confused. However, at this time, he had no time to think about the answer of the mysterious disappearance of the Daming Lake. Seeing that the fog gradually dispersed and the green forest gradually appeared, he pulled the bow and arrow again as fast as he could. He endured the sharp pain in his shoulder and ignored the blood still flowing between his fingers. He vigilantly searched the surrounding scene with his eyes and psyche power. His vision became clear again, and the frenzied chi of heaven and earth fluctuated calmly. It meant that the things that protected him like a trench previously did not exist. The Tao addict could find him at any time and launch another attack. The front gate of the Devil's Doctrine had been opened, but neither he nor Mo Shanshan were seriously injured because of it. Naturally, he did not believe that the powerful and crazy Tao addict would suffer any serious damage. The sharp and cold arrowhead of the talisman arrow moved steadily and slowly, aiming at all directions in the clear vision. It was ready to leave the tight string and shoot at the red dress that suddenly appeared. However, when the fog dissipated, he still did not find Yi Hongyu's figure, no matter with his eyes or psyche power. He did not even hear the slightest noise. The whole green valley became extremely quiet. It was not absolute silence. There was the sound of spring water and gurgling water, which sounded intermittently around the surroundings. Ning Ke did not know where the Tao addict had gone, but his intuition told him that it should be temporarily safe. He slowly pulled back the bow and looked at Mo Shanshan beside him. He took a few steps around, and the soles of his boots stepped on the gravel, making a rustling sound. At this time, they were indeed at the original bottom of the Daming Lake, but they were not stepping on black mud or silver fine sand, but dense stones full of edges. A few days ago, when he was comprehending Tao and breaking the realm by the Daming Lake, he found that the quiet lake was not very large. However, walking at the bottom of the dry lake today, he found that it was actually very large, like a giant hollowed-out stone bowl. It was a quiet lake in winter a moment ago, and the next moment it became a dry gravel ground. This was really an incredible and magical scene. However, thinking that the Devil's Doctrine's front gate was an unknown place, Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan did not show too much emotion, although they could not suppress the shock in their hearts. After a moment of observation, the two finally found out where the lake water had gone. There was water in the gravel under their feet, but it was just a very thin and shallow layer. It seeped in a certain direction along the cracks of the gravel, and then gradually converged into a flat stream, flowing to the low-lying place, and finally disappearing in the center of the lake. Nothing strange could be seen at the center of the lake, but the fact that so much water could be released in such a short period of time inevitably gave people a strange feeling. It was as if there was an ancient beast opening its greedy mouth there. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan looked at each other, and walked toward the center of the lake, following the direction of the flowing water. However, after a few steps, he suddenly frowned, and his feet seemed to be filled with lead, and he could no longer lift them. Mo Shanshan, who was beside him, became extremely pale, and seemed to be in extreme pain. What's going on? Ning Ke felt the frightening aura, and frowned as he looked around, but he could not see anything unusual. There was a gravel at the bottom of the lake, and there was indeed nothing unusual. There were only stones. These stones were of different sizes and shapes. Some were hollow like works of art carved by the wind, some were round like drums, some were slender like a forest, and some looked strange and indescribable. Some stones were covered with thick moss, and some were as smooth as jade. However, no matter what kind of stones they were, there was no trace of lake water on them, as if they had not been soaked in the lake for thousands of years. The stones all over the mountains and valleys appeared in their sight, as if they appeared in their chests at the same time. Even the smooth stones were full of invisible sharp edges, which made people feel suffocated and uneasy when they saw them. That kind of feeling was neither comfortable nor painful, but full of resentment, unwillingness, and stubbornness. Ning Ke looked at these stones in front of him, and finally felt strange. Mo Shanshan beside him looked at these stones, and her pale face suddenly flushed. Her eyes were abnormally bright, and her thin lips trembled slightly. She said incredulously, "Is this the stone array tactics?" Ning Ke asked, "What is the stone array tactics?" Mo Shanshan said in a trembling voice, "The West Hill scripture once recorded a kind of tactical array. That kind of tactical array stretches between heaven and earth, and it is unimaginably powerful. Compared with it, the confinement divine tactical array of the judicial department is simply not worth mentioning." Her face was full of awe and admiration. Looking at the seemingly random stones around her, she said, "I always thought that this kind of tactical array could only exist in legends. I didn't expect that someone could really set it up successfully." Ning Ke asked curiously, "These stones are the legendary powerful tactical array stone array tactics that stretches between heaven and earth?" Mo Shanshan turned her head and looked into his eyes, and said seriously, "The stone array tactics are stones. Due to the limitation of my body, I can't be too full in the recent updates. I don't think about the first place in April's monthly votes for the time being. But I still need to be ambitious. Otherwise, the energy of the stone array tactics is too strong, and it will not look good in the future. If you have the monthly votes, please encourage me. Although I can't guarantee the quantity, I can guarantee the quality. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to vote for me and vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 264. Ning Ke stood among the stones all over the mountains and valleys, feeling the aura. He covered his chest and frowned slightly. He did not speak for a long time. At this time, his chest seemed to be stuffed with dozens of hard pebbles, which were about to reach his throat. It was so suffocating and uncomfortable that he could not speak. Previously, he did not understand Mo Shanshan's words that the stone array tactics was a stone. It was not until these stones of different shapes filled his eye sockets and blocked his chest and abdomen that he realized that the so-called stone array tactics was the unfairness in his chest and abdomen that he did not know why. The unfairness eventually condensed into stones and could not be carefree. Stone was the most common and the most unusual thing in the world. It existed silently between heaven and earth for thousands of years. It could grow grass, but the grass was a foreign object. It could crack, but it was still a stone. Even if it was weathered into gravel, it was still a descendant of stone. Its body was so strong and pure as if it would never change. Ning Ke looked at the thousands of stones between heaven and earth and could not help but think of some words that his master, Master Yen Sei, once said, "Pavilions and terraces will always be blown away by wind and rain, but the stone foundation will not be destroyed for thousands of years. It seems to be dirty, but it is extremely clean." Everything in the world had its own aura, which was the primordial qi. Jade and gold were inconvenient to be exposed. Only the stone was the most silent and low-key. Its aura was strong but deep inside, and it was never willing to release it wantonly. Therefore, for cultivators, the stone was the most difficult existence to perceive, and it was even more difficult to control. Thinking that these stones had existed quietly for countless years at the bottom of the lake, in the sea, in the mountains, under the ridges, and kept their own aura, but did not want to be known by heaven and earth, Ning Ke suddenly understood something. The cultivation method of Devil's doctrine absorbed the aura of nature into the body, which was equivalent to creating one's own world in the body. In the doctrine of Haotian, this was a great blasphemy and disrespect, so it was called the devil by the world. How similar were the stones in the Great Blockage Formation to those who cultivated the cultivation method of devil's doctrine? Wasn't this unbearable stubbornness between heaven and earth the silent resistance to Haotian? When the talisman tactical was cultivated to a high level, it would converge into the same river. Mo Shanshan was addicted to talisman Taoism and tactical matrix. She felt the magic of this great blockage formation and found that she seemed to become a little naughty stone at the bottom of the water for thousands of years. The aura of the great blockage formation made her pale face show a sense of exhaustion, but she didn't care about the pain in her body at all. She looked around at the scattered stones and concentrated on the secrets hidden among them. Ning Ke looked at her tightly knitted eyebrows and shook his head, saying, "These stones imply a certain attitude. I think the person who had the ability and courage to set up this great blockage formation could only be the great divine priest of light who went to the wilderness to preach, but eventually betrayed Haotian and founded the devil's doctrine." Mo Shanshan raised her head, and her beautiful slightly round cheeks were full of surprise and puzzlement. After a while, she understood that since this was the front gate of devil's doctrine, the superior who set up the great blockage formation was certainly related to devil's doctrine. She believed in Ning Ke's inference. Although she was a little regretful that such a beautiful and magical big formation was created by the people of devil's doctrine, she didn't think too much about it. Her mind quickly immersed itself in the stones in the mountains and valleys again. The bottom of the lake was dry and gravel, and there were tens of thousands of stones lying in the wilderness. This kind of scenery was not beautiful, but in the eyes of the calligraphy addict, it was beautiful beyond compare. It contained great wisdom that made her heart palpitate. How to pour the stone array tactics in the heart. Looking at the tens of thousands of stones lying between the sky and the earth, the girl looked intoxicated and murmured, "That person used thousands of hectares of lake water to cover the sharp edges of the great blockage formation with the lake water. When the cover formation was broken, the lake water would be drawn away according to the power of nature, and the great blockage formation would reappear in the world. This kind of situation is really wonderful." Ning Ke had lived a hard life since he was a child. Although he could write well, he couldn't recite a good poem. His aesthetic was weak and boring. Facing the broken stones in the mountains, he really couldn't see anything beautiful, let alone the situation of the great blockage formation. He only felt that the stones in his chest and abdomen were about to spew out from his throat. He was so uncomfortable that he was anxious to find a way to leave or go in. Looking at Mo Shanshan's intoxicated look, although he couldn't bear it, he had to interrupt her and asked, "Since this big formation is so powerful, can we go in?" It was said that the calligraphy addict was gentle and virtuous. However, once she was really intoxicated, she would completely forget the outside world and even her internal injuries. How could she wake up so easily? She didn't hear Ning Ke's words at all. She said sadly, "This great blockage formation has been destroyed once. Now there is probably only 1 in 100 left. It's a pity. I don't know what the great blockage formation would be like when it was opened in good condition. I don't know whether there will be anyone who can make the stone array tactics reappear in the world in the future." She was very sad, but Ning Ke was a little happy. He thought that if it were not so, they would have been dead long ago. He comforted her casually, "Let's find a way to go in first. In the future, you can study the tactical formation more. It's not difficult to make the stone array tactics reappear." Mo Shanshan was silent, and no one knew what she was thinking about. Her slightly sparse and slender eyelashes gently blinked. After a moment, her thin lips slightly opened, and she looked at Ning Ke and said seriously, 13th brother, you are right. There are very few people in the world who can see this stone array tactics. Since I have seen it and understood it, then I have to find a way to make it reappear in the world in the future. If I don't work hard to cultivate and study, the stone array tactics will really disappear. Then it will be my responsibility. Ning Ke didn't expect that a casual sentence could make her take the initiative to carry such a heavy responsibility. The inheritance in the cultivation world was always broken. It was naturally a good thing if she could pick up this magical tactical formation again. However, he was a little worried that such a heavy responsibility would affect her state of mind and cultivation. He was speechless for a while. Suddenly, he thought of a problem. The stones on the mountain were so powerful when only 1% of the power was left. What kind of invincible existence would it be when it was intact? This legendary tactical formation named Stone Array Tactics could make the calligraphy addict so intoxicated and leave its illustrious reputation in the West Hill Classics. But its foundation was actually destroyed by someone? Who on earth had the ability to destroy such a big tactical formation back then? Thinking of this question, he looked at an ordinary stone in front of him and squatted down. He slowly stretched out his fingers and gently stroked the 2 lines of moss on the stone. As his fingertips moved, the moss peeled off, revealing the deep marks inside. Those marks were clear sword marks. They had been covered by the lake water and moss for decades and had never seen the light of day. Ning Ke turned his head to look elsewhere and found that there were some stones in this great blockage formation with similar streaks of moss. Presumably, under those streaks of moss, there were also similar sword marks. The sword marks on the stone were divided into 2 lines. They were simple and even a little rough. One sword on the left and the other on the right were very casual, but they revealed an unparalleled sense of toughness. After many years, the moss attached to the sword marks and wrote a word. Ning Ke felt the touch of his fingertips and the remaining faint aura between the sword marks. He understood that these simple but powerful sword marks directly destroyed the foundation of the Great Blockage Formation. The aura between the sword marks was very familiar and very close. It was exactly the same as the aura that led him to this verdant valley a few days ago. However, it was much fainter. It should be the remnant of that aura. Then he noticed that the cross-section of some stones was too smooth, which was obviously cut. He found 3 pieces and put them together. He found that a whole stone was indeed cut into 3 pieces by 2 swords. The 3 pieces of broken stone were restored to a whole according to the smooth sword marks. A few wisps of dust sprayed out from the cracks, and the remaining aura also became a little stronger. Ning Ke silently looked at the sword marks on the stone in front of him, as if he once again saw the cedar stubbornly surviving on the top of the snow-capped peak. It was strong and proud but disdainful. It overlooked the common people but disdained to look at the sky. The aura of the person who broke the formation many years ago was very similar to that of the Great Blockage Formation. They were both so stubborn and full of sharpness. However, if one carefully tasted them, they were essentially different. The great divine priest of light, who founded the devil's doctrine 1,000 years ago, locked his unwillingness and resentment in the stone when he set up the Great Blockage Formation. He only stood between heaven and earth in a silent posture, using silence and sharpness to express his attitude and strength to heaven. The message transmitted by the remaining aura of the person who broke the formation decades ago was clearer and brighter. Although he was often silent, he never meant to lock himself. He was always free and generous. If there was a little dissatisfaction, he would straighten his waist and stab it. When he didn't say it, it was because he disdained to say it. Once he said it, he would let the whole heaven know. How to cast the Great Blockage Formation. Mo Shanshan said that there was only the lake water. Ning Ke looked at the sword marks on the stone and knew that there was another answer, at least there was one many years ago. Decades ago, it was still this verdant valley, and the lake water was still in it. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, and the tactical array of the front gate of Devil's Doctrine was activated. The lake water was emptied, and the water fell and the stone came out. When the stone came out, the Great Blockage Formation appeared. It stretched between heaven and earth and blocked the way of the world. A scholar in a green robe rode a little black donkey and walked in the world. Suddenly, the road ahead was blocked. The rocks that filled the mountains and valleys made him unhappy. So he drew out the sword at his waist and cut the legendary Great Blockage Formation into pieces. Then, he rode on the little black donkey and continued to curse the heavens and the earth. His eyebrows and spirits were equally high, and he was very happy. How to cast the stone array? Just the righteous qi in his chest was enough. Decades later, Ning Ke knelt before the sword mark on the stone and kowtowed 3 times respectfully. The familiar aura of the sword mark condensed into a mountain in his sense of perception. The mountain was high but not dangerous, similar to the big mountain behind the academy. It made his eyes slightly sour and his chest filled with endless emotions. Such a person was indeed worthy of second brother's worship with his life and Mistress Jian's memory with the rest of her life. Naturally, he was also worthy of his unreasonable and vicissitudes of pride from his knees to the top of his head. This chapter is so satisfying to write. There are so many characters in this story that fit my aesthetic standards. I feel so good when I write about them. Today is Monday. Please support me with your recommendation votes. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 265. At this time, Mo Shanshan was still immersed in the shock brought by the Great Blockage Formation and did not notice Ning Quebec. She looked at the stones all over the mountain and valley and gradually frowned. She said, although it has been destroyed, the residual array intent is still strong. It is impossible to calculate it clearly in a short time. Do you still insist on going inside? Their goal was to enter the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine to find the tomes of Arcane. Especially now that they had confirmed where the strong and distant aura came from, Ning Ke naturally would not give up halfway. He looked at her and asked, "Can we still retreat?" Mo Shanshan looked at the stones around her in silence. After a moment of calculation, she nodded and said, "We have just entered the array. If we retreat, we may not be able to retreat anymore. I don't know what kind of dangers are hidden inside." Ning Ke looked at the mottled sword marks on the stones in front of him and suddenly said, "Do you believe in fate?" Mo Shanshan was slightly stunned and did not know why he would ask such a question at this time. Ning Ke looked at her and said, "Now I believe in fate more and more. I entered the wilderness and came to this valley with a calligraphy addict who is proficient in tactical arrays. I believe that fate has already made arrangements for this." Mo Shanshan understood what he meant. At this moment, Ning Ke suddenly sensed something. He suddenly turned around, pulled the iron bow and put a talisman arrow on it. He aimed at a direction far away from the stones and the arrowhead was pointing at the red shadow. Tao addict Yi Hongyu appeared again. She stepped on the angular stones barefoot and quickly swept in this direction. Her bare legs under her red dress were tight and straight. Her left shoulder was still bleeding and her face was a little pale. It seemed that the outbreak of the aura of heaven and earth when the Great Blockage Formation was activated had caused some damage to her, but not too serious. The red dress flew and whistled. The distance between them seemed to be far but was actually very close. Logically speaking, they should have come into contact immediately. However, it was very strange that the Tao addict's trajectory inexplicably changed between the stones. She was moving forward in a straight line, but on the way, she turned to the right and then stopped and began to circle. Yi Hongyu stopped and stood on a stone in silence. She probably understood that it was because of the tactical array. Then she looked up at Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan and said, "You are so lucky." If the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine had not been activated, Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan might have been stabbed into 2 pools of blood by the Tao addict's Taoist swords. That was why she said that they were lucky. The Great Blockage Formation was really magical. They were standing opposite each other and could hear each other, but it was not real. Ning Ke aimed the primordial 13 arrows at Yi Hongyu and confirmed that the light between the rocks was refracted in a strange way. Even the space was distorted and he could not hit her. Action and reaction always complemented each other. The primordial 13 arrows could not aim at the Tao addict, and the Tao addict naturally could not find their real location in this pile of rocks. After confirming this, Ning Ke put away the iron bow and nodded to the Tao addict on the stone not far away, as if she was just a passerby. Then he left silently with Mo Shanshan and walked toward the place where the water fell. As the two walked deeper into the center of the lake, the remaining water between the soles of their boots and the gravel became thinner and thinner. However, the intent of the array stones between the rocks became stronger and stronger. The chi of heaven and earth was extremely impeded here. The invisible and intangible air seemed to have sharp edges, which made every simple breath very painful. Ning Ke rubbed his cheeks that were numb because of the blockage in his chest and abdomen. He asked Mo Shanshan, she should think of going to the place where the water fell. Do you think it is possible that she is faster than us? Mo Shanshan's face was pale, and her slightly sparse eyelashes looked so weak. She said softly, I can find some paths in the Great Blockage Formation, but she can't. Only a person with a strong heart could walk to the end of his own path, and a person with a strong heart would naturally be stubborn and proud in some aspects. At this time, Mo Shanshan was calculating the tactical array and her mind was exhausted. However, the indifferent words of, she can't, naturally revealed a bit of strength. Hearing this, Ning Ke immediately felt relieved and continued to help her move forward. They walked cautiously and slowly in the rocks. As time went by, Mo Shanshan's mind became more and more scattered, and her body became weaker. Although she still forcibly kept her mind clear and pointed in the direction, she was almost unable to stand even if she was supported. Ning Ke looked at her pale cheeks and slightly trembling long eyelashes. He shook his head and directly carried her on his back. Without waiting for her to speak, he directly said, I'm relatively sturdy, so I can hold on for a while. Mo Shanshan gently agreed and did not resist. She slowly leaned her face on his shoulder, and her black hair poured down from Ning Ke's chest like a waterfall. She closed her eyes and calmly looked as if she was sleeping, only occasionally pointing in the direction. The array intent in the rocks was rugged, and the sharp air directly penetrated into the body from the air, which was extremely uncomfortable and painful. Moreover, he had to carry a person on his back at this time. Although Ning Ke said he could hold on, in fact, he was almost unable to. However, he had once walked on the difficult mountain road in the back of the Academy's mountain, and he had walked on many similar painful roads. More importantly, every time he really could not hold on, he could occasionally see the clear sword marks and moss on the stones beside the road, which would instill a strong motivation and courage in his body. Decades ago, that person broke into the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine with only a sword. At that time, the Great Blockage Formation was intact and its power was 100 times stronger than today, but that person still broke in. After decades, as that person's junior, how could he not inherit his strong will and give up halfway to make that person lose face? The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, stood on the stone and looked at the two figures gradually disappearing in the rocks. Her clothes had been torn in many places, and the blood scabs on her shoulders were extremely horrible. Moreover, she was the only one left here at this time, which made her look a little lonely. She did not recognize that this pile of rocks was the legendary Great Blockage Formation, but she knew that these rocks contained a terrible array force. Even as strong as she would feel afraid in front of these rocks. Suddenly, she shouted angrily, and the sound spread back among the rocks, hitting the higher cliff of the verdant valley and then bouncing back. The emptiness made her more lonely and speechless. The angry shout stopped abruptly. She tore off a corner of her skirt and silently tied up the wound on her shoulder. She ignored the spring breeze under her body and jumped off the stone, following the last thin layer of water, and walked to the center of the lake. The hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace had once praised this girl for being proficient in all kinds of dharma. However, although she was obsessed with cultivation, she could never touch the world of talisman arrays. She only guessed that the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine should be at the beginning of the bottom of the water, in the center of this dry lake. However, she did not know how to get through this pile of rocks and reach the place she wanted to reach. Based on the sight on the stone and the perception of psyche power, she made her own judgment. However, after a few steps among the rocks, she found that she had lost her direction again. The various kinds of rocks scattered around her were like the peach trees at the southern foot of the Peach Mountain. They had the magical ability to distort space. If she went on like this, she might never reach the center of the lake. Perhaps she would be trapped in this pile of rocks forever, until she finally broke down and died of thirst and madness. Yi Hongyu looked behind her and confirmed that there was still a chance of survival if she left this pile of rocks. If she took a few more steps, she would be trapped in the stone array and it would be difficult to get out. She could not help but fall into a long silence. Then she noticed the moss on the stones and the sword marks that had been hidden under the moss for decades. She vaguely remembered who left these sword marks. Her indifferent eyes suddenly became extremely bright. Her body trembled with excitement, and blood seeped out from her shoulder. In the eyes of cultivators who were qualified to know the secrets of the past, the madman who broke into the front gate with a single sword and destroyed the Devil's Doctrine with a wave of his sleeve was undoubtedly the most powerful man in the world. Although the madman who destroyed the Devil's Doctrine with a single sword became the unparalleled enemy of the West Hill Divine Palace and was finally punished by heaven, no one on the Peach Mountain, including the three great divine priests, was willing to mention his name. However, the Tao addict was obsessed with cultivation, fighting, and improving her strength. She wanted to be the most powerful man in the world and admired the most powerful man. Therefore, ever since she knew the story, she had secretly worshipped the most powerful man in the world. In the present world, she idolized her brother. In the past thousands of years, she idolized the madman. Today, she had suffered many setbacks and was in a humiliating situation because of this pile of rocks. At this moment, she suddenly saw the sword marks left by the man she worshipped so passionately. She was so shocked that she could not speak. She finally saw the traces of the legend, saw the historical scenes, and saw the state that she worshipped and yearned for. Suddenly, a sense of pride rose in her chest and she breathed out the edge of the shattering array. In a breath, Yi Hongyu's expression calmed down. She slowly pulled out the Taoist sword from her waist and held it horizontally in front of her. Facing the moss marks on the stone in front of her, she said decisively, "Mr. Ku's sword style is before me. How dare I disappoint you?" As soon as she finished speaking, the wind of the sword rose. She calmly and attentively chopped at the stone in front of her. She did not know the array and did not know how to find a path. Therefore, she simply chopped all the stones in front of her, hoping to carve out a path. She did not know whether it was right or wrong to do so, but in front of the sword style of the predecessor, she just wanted to do so. The water of the Daming Lake had dissipated, leaving the ground full of rocks. Compared with the verdant valley, it looked extremely desolate and frightening. Tang stood at the original lakeside and looked down at the rocks. After a moment of silence, he said, "Everything changed after that man came. The stone array tactics became different from before." Tang Xiaotang stood beside her brother and curiously looked at the pile of rocks below. Listening to the faint sound of metal cutting rocks, she stuck out her tongue and sighed, "That woman is really crazy." Tang said, "The world calls us demons. How can we be less crazy if we want to enter the holy land of the Enlightenment doctrine to find out what a demon is? As the saying goes, how can one become a demon without going crazy?" That person was the same back then. This was Tang Xiaotang's first time coming to her own sect's holy land. She nervously asked, "Brother, are we really going to let them go in like this? The Enlightenment doctrine's sacred land has always been known as a land of death. Even if you enter, you don't know if you can come out alive. For the sake of the tomes of arcane that have disappeared long ago, these people really don't care about life and death. Thinking that Ning Ke had probably entered the front gate of the Holy Land at this time, Tang's two cast-iron eyebrows suddenly furrowed. He seemed to feel that there was something he couldn't understand. He said to himself, "Are you going to keep watching? Could it be that you have the confidence to enter the Holy Land to save him? Don't tell me, you were really on the other end 14 years ago?" Friendly advertisement, a wretched fat panda's new book, Dark Judgment. Please go and watch it if you are interested. The book number is 2278933. Please support me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 266. In the verdant valley, beside a dry lake, on top of a pile of rocks, Tang Xiaotang untied the beast's tail on her collar, revealing her white and tender face. She listened to the sound of a sword breaking the rocks and asked, "Brother, is the tomes of arcane really inside?" Tang shook his head and said, "I don't know." Tang Xiaotang was puzzled and asked, "Then why did those old guys from the Divine Hall send people here?" Tang said, "According to the news from the Central Plains, the great divine priest of Revelation issued a decree after returning from the south. He said that the tomes of arcane will appear when the Holy Land opens." Tang Xiaotang scratched her head and asked, "But didn't you say that the Holy Land became a ruin after it was destroyed and there was nothing inside? Why is the old guy called Priest of Revelation so sure that the tomes of arcane are here?" Tang said, "The three great divine priests of the Divine Hall each have their own profound attainments. The great divine priest of Revelation sensed the will of Haotian. It is said that he may even have the ability of prophecy. Who would not believe what he said?" Tang Xiaotang suddenly thought of the Taoist priest who sang on the cliff peak. She did not know why there was a trace of fear in her heart. She asked, "Brother, do you think that person will come to snatch the tomes of arcane?" Tang Xiaotang was silent for a long time and shook his head. "No, because there is someone more important than the tomes of arcane in his heart." As time went by, the night grew longer in the extreme north of this world, and the weather became colder. In this mountain abandoned by Haotian, the verdant valley that had disappeared for decades reappeared. The Daming Lake was emptied, and the legendary Great Blockage Formation was reactivated. The Chi of Heaven and Earth was attached to the snow-capped peak and pointed to the sky. How amazing it was! The Chi of Heaven and Earth caused by the reopening of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was extinguished in a very short time, but this wave still spread out of the vast snow mountain and spread to more distant places. In the wilderness on the outskirts of the Tianqi Mountains, black soil and white snow mixed together. Occasionally, one could see dead beasts on the snowy ground. The cold winter wind was like a knife blowing against the tents, making them flutter. They themselves were the sharpest hunting knives. Yi Su walked silently between heaven and earth. The ordinary Taoist robe on his body was as smooth as a cliff wall, completely unaffected by the cold wind. He seemed to be walking normally with his knees raised, but in an instant, he walked more than 100 feet straight. His footsteps landed on the floating snow without leaving a trace, and he floated like an immortal. When the primal chi of heaven and earth from the reopening of the Devil's Doctrine in the distant mountains reached his world from behind, he slowly stopped and looked back expressionlessly. However, he had no intention of going over to take a look. As a world wayfarer of the Jishou Abbey, Yi Su knew about the great divine priest of relations edict earlier than anyone else. He even knew that the Ming hand scroll of the 7 tomes of arcane would reappear in the wilderness before the great divine priest of relation himself. However, for a cultivator at his level, he could even see through the gates of death. Naturally, He could see through all external objects and would not let those external objects affect his heart, even if those external objects were heavenly tomes. Moreover, he had made a bet with Tang on the promise of breaking the realm between Ning Ke and Long Qing. Since he had lost, he naturally had to admit defeat. It was not a matter of whether he could see through it or not, but he could not allow himself to leave any shadow in his state of mind. His appearance in the wilderness had nothing to do with the tomes of arcane, the desolate man's southward journey, or the reopening of the devil's doctrine's front gate. He had lived in the abbey since he was a child, and the 6 volumes of tomes of arcane were his first books since he could read. He had looked at the world coldly since he was a child. The desolate man's southward journey might be a big deal to the secular world, but it could not attract his attention at all. The reopening of the devil's doctrine's front gate was relatively interesting. However, the devil's doctrine had already withered and was no longer a threat. There were too few people or things in this world that were qualified to make him leave the Jishou Abbey. However, the person who stood on the other end of the line 14 years ago was definitely qualified. Yi Su really wanted to meet that person. He had thought about it for many years, but that person had always been in the mountain and beside the mountain. Even someone as proud and powerful as him could not get close to that person. This year, the person on the other end of the line finally left the mountain and came to the wilderness. He did not know where that person was. But he knew that he would meet that person. Because the unique temperament of the mountain and that person's temperament had determined this. That person wanted to protect the little guy called Ning Quebec. So when Ning Ke was really in danger, that person must be beside him. So he only needed to wait until Ning Ke was really in danger. But at this time, Ning Ke was outside the front gate of the devil's doctrine. Why did he leave the front gate of the devil's doctrine and head south? There was a big blue lake in the south of the Tianqi mountain. It was the Hulun Sea, which was regarded as the holy land by the grassland barbarians. At this time, there was a thin layer of ice floating on the surface of the lake. The men of the grassland tribes who had lived by the lake for generations were fishing for some aquatic plants in the lake before the ice was completely sealed. Wherever there were grassland barbarians, there would often be caravans from the Central Plains. However, it was after all the winter and the war between the grassland and the Central Plains coalition army had just ended. It was a little strange for a caravan from the Central Plains to appear by the Hulun Sea. However, these merchants were extravagant and had paid the deposit for leather goods at the end of next summer. So the tribal headmen acquiesced to their existence and even allocated a camp for them. The caravan from the Central Plains was cooking by the lake. Dozens of people were sitting around the fire. Taking advantage of the rare sunny weather, they did not enter the tents to avoid the cold. Looking at their actions, it seemed that they were led by one of the merchants. The rather stout merchant was gnawing on a greasy leg of lamb and grumbling from time to time. It was obvious that he was not very satisfied with the hospitality of the grassland barbarians. A burly middle-aged man wearing a felt hat next to him, who was probably a steward or a bodyguard, tried to persuade him in a soft voice. However, he was scolded instead. All of a sudden, countless white clouds appeared in the clear blue sky. It was as if an invisible giant hand had directly torn the blue canvas apart and the white paint behind it seeped out. The grassland barbarians and the merchants from the Central Plains noticed the strange phenomenon in the sky at the same time and looked up in surprise. The leader of the merchants cursed a few times. The well-built middle-aged guard with a respectful expression narrowed his eyes as he looked at the clouds in the sky. His expression gradually turned solemn. For some unknown reason, the stout merchant became serious when he saw the solemn expression of the middle-aged man. He did not dare to scold him anymore. He lowered his head to hide the awe in his eyes and asked a few questions in a low voice. The middle-aged man looked at the white clouds in the sky quietly and felt the fluctuation of the aura of heaven and earth coming from the foothills in the far north. His face, which was covered by the shadow of the felt hat, slowly revealed a very complicated expression. It was an expression of nostalgia, warmth, and calmness after a long time. However, it was also mixed with some extremely faint regret and sadness. Then the middle-aged man said very succinctly, "The door is open." Ning Kai carried Mo Shanshan's weak body on his back and stepped on the stones on the ground with difficulty. When he reached the center of the lake, he saw a very large stone door. The stone door was so huge that it looked like a small mountain when looked up from below. Even the most magnificent city in the world, Chang'an, did not have such a magnificent and huge stone door. Because of its huge size, this was the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Ning Kai did not think that he would find the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine so easily. For a moment, he could not believe his eyes. He could not understand how such a magnificent and huge stone door was hidden in the Daming Lake and why he did not see it when he walked in the Great Blockage Formation. He subconsciously looked back at the way he came. When he walked in the rugged stones and the fierce formation, he could not see the stone door at all. However, when he walked out, the stone door appeared in front of him, as if the stone door was only willing to be seen by the person it chose. Opening the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was even easier than finding the front gate. He did not need to recite any incantation, nor did he need any amazing and terrible mechanism. When Ning Kai's right hand gently touched the rough and solemn surface of the stone door, there was a soft sound. Countless years of accumulated dust splashed out from the cracks of the stone door, and then the stone door slowly opened. Ning Kai looked up at the snow-capped peak, which was even more towering and majestic than before. Then his eyes met Mo Shanshan's shocked and weak eyes, and he stepped in. Majesty, solemnity, solemnity, grandeur, holiness. This kind of special feeling was often built on a huge scale. For example, Chang'an City, which the goshawk did not dare to fly over, and the Divine Hall on the Peach Mountain overlooking the common people. When these buildings and the small human body formed a strong contrast, this kind of feeling would be produced. When they walked into the huge stone door and climbed up tens of thousands of long stone steps, they came to the main hall of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. These feelings instantly occupied the minds of Ning Kai and Mo Shanshan. Because the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine they saw was more magnificent and huge than any building they had seen before. The front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was in the mountain, or more precisely, in the majestic snow-capped peak by the Daming Lake. The Devil's Doctrine was in a huge space formed after the belly of a towering snow-capped peak was completely hollowed out. This space was so big that it was completely unimaginable. No one knew how deep it was, and no one knew how high it was. It was even so big that it gave people the illusion that this was a place that could only appear in dreams, a world that only Haotian had the power to open up. No one knew where the clear light came from, but there were countless thick and huge stone beams lying across the space. These stone beams had clear and orderly marks made by knives and axes. They were extremely thick and the surface was enough for 4-horse carriages to run side by side. The two looked at the wide and straight stone beam in front of them and felt that they could not see the end of the stone beam at all. However, the thick stone beams in the distance were like extremely thin spider silk in the huge space. The thick stone beams gathered in the middle like a spider web, and finally converged into a stone platform in the middle of the distant rocky peak. A palace could be seen on the platform from afar. The palace should be huge, but looking at it from the cliff, it looked like a hollow microsculpture carved by a skilled craftsman on a grain of rice. As for Ning Kai and Mo Shanshan, who were far away from the palace, they seemed to not exist in this huge space, like a grain of sand between the rock walls. The two looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. In the face of such an incredible and magnificent existence, no one would be able to suppress a sense of awe. They would want to kneel down and worship it, and even cry because of their own insignificance. Because in front of such a magnificent world, human beings could only be ants. However, What really shocked Ning Ke was that this huge space that only Haotian had the power to open up was actually opened up by those ant-like human beings 1,000 years ago. After thinking about the chapter name for more than 10 minutes, I really can't think of a better one. Because I care a little, I always want to come up with a good one. It's really a headache. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 267. After a long time, Ning Ke gradually woke up from the shock, but his emotions were still complicated. It was also the legendary unknown place. The back mountain of the academy only gave people a sense of closeness and warmth, but it did not give people a spiritual impact like this place. He thought that this was probably the difference that Mo Shanshan had mentioned that day. The back mountain of the academy could connect the saints and the secular world, while the front gate of the devil's doctrine was indifferent to the secular world. The front gate of the devil's doctrine had long been abandoned after being buried by the wind and snow in Tianqi Mountain for decades. It looked desolate, and the more spacious and majestic it was, the more desolate it felt. Ning Ke thought of the scene when the devil's doctrine was still strong, and countless believers knelt on the huge stone beam to worship. He could not help but sigh. It was hard to imagine that the desolate man 1,000 years ago could dig such a huge space in the middle of the snow-capped peak. Ning Ke thought that it was the Tang Empire that drove the desolate man out of the wilderness and to the cold region of the far north. He could not help but sigh and feel a strong sense of pride. Then, through the magnificent and almost nature-defying architectural space in front of him, he thought of more things. The devil's doctrine was not tolerated in the world because the cultivators of the devil's doctrine forcibly absorbed the heaven and earth into their bodies, which blasphemed Haotian. The great divine priest of light, who founded the devil's doctrine, let the desolate man dig such a space in the Tianqi Mountain that was almost like a miracle. Perhaps he wanted to prove that humans could also have the same ability as Haotian through this place? In the world where Haotian shone, it was extremely arrogant to use this silent way to express disrespect to Haotian. No wonder the Enlightenment doctrine was called the devil. After standing at the edge of the rock wall and watching silently for a long time, Ning Ke helped Mo Shanshan up the stone beam. The thick stone beam connected the space in the middle of the snow-capped peak and finally converged in the distant sky. The stone beam was so wide and thick that it could accommodate 4 horse carriages side by side. Looking at the impact marks and gravel, it could be confirmed that the rocks that fell from the top of the cave for thousands of years could not break the stone beam. It was even more impossible for the two of them to walk on it. However, the stone beam was suspended high in the air and there was no shelter around it. The mountain wind whistled and the echoes slowly reverberated, giving people an extremely terrifying feeling. Ning Ke looked at the empty world outside the stone beam and listened to the wind in his ears. He felt that his legs were a little stiff. He thought that if he was blown out of the stone beam by the mountain wind, he might have to fly in the air for a long time before falling into the deep and dark underground. The stone beam leading to the center of the huge space was very long. The two of them walked for a long time, but they had only covered less than 1/3 of the distance. The palace on the distant suspended stone platform was still as small as a miniature landscape. However, the feeling of insignificance and fear in the magnificent space gradually faded as they walked. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan walked much faster than at the beginning. He could even spare some attention to look at the scenery around the stone beam, even though the stone beam was completely dark and empty. There was no scenery at all. Then he noticed that deep lines suddenly appeared under his feet. Those lines were deeply engraved into the hard stone beam and seemed to extend in all directions irregularly. There were extremely small gravel rolling in the lines with the mountain wind. Ning Ke looked at it carefully with the help of the light falling from above. He found that the lines on the stone beams combined to form a very concise painting. The strokes of the painting were clumsy and powerful. It should have been engraved by metal weapons inside the axes and knives. It looked like some kind of ancient rock painting. The rock paintings on the stone beam gradually appeared in front of them as they walked. These rock paintings were very large and there were many of them. The first rock painting was a painting of a monstrous flood. A man with a blurred face, wearing clothes that looked like a grass skirt around his waist and holding a pick in his hand, stood on the cliff by the flood and roared angrily at the rainy sky. The second rock painting was a painting of wildfire in the mountains. Several women with blurred faces, wearing coarse short skirts and holding a basin of water in their hands, stood in the bamboo forest by the wildfire and cried bitterly at the burning wheat fields. The third rock painting was a painting of heavy snow that covered the sky. Dozens of farmers with blurred faces, wrapped in thick animal skins and holding all kinds of tools in their hands, ignored the falling snowflakes and silently and attentively repaired the houses. The fourth rock painting was a painting of the quaking earth. Thousands of black spots without faces stood in the scarred fields, as if they were burying the dead and saving the living. They did not roar or cry, but continued with their lives. Every rock painting depicted the anger of Haotian when he descended to the human world. It depicted the pain and struggle of human beings. No matter how blurred the faces of the people in the rock paintings were, they clearly showed the identity of human beings. The rock paintings on the stone beam were still spreading forward. With the mastery of tools, determination and understanding of nature, human beings became calmer and calmer in the face of all kinds of disasters. Perhaps they were still sad and angry, but no matter what, they survived and lived until now. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan looked at the rock paintings under their feet as they walked. Their expressions gradually became solemn. Although they could not fully understand or be sure of the real intention of the people of the Devil's Doctrine to carve these rock paintings on the stone beam, as a member of human beings, they would always have some vague feelings. At the very front of the stone beam, the last rock painting was very simple, with fewer lines than all the previous rock paintings. At the bottom were 3 straight lines mixed with countless small stone holes, probably representing human beings who had already multiplied and occupied the whole world. Those small stone holes seemed to be the hands of human beings who had raised high in celebration. Above the 3 straight lines, the deep stone lines formed a circle and a semicircle. Mo Shanshan frowned slightly and looked at the simple and incomprehensible patterns under her feet. She thought about what kind of information it contained, but no matter how she thought, she had no clue. Ning Ke stared at the last rock painting, and his hand holding Mo Shanshan trembled slightly. He felt a little cold and vaguely guessed something, but felt that his guess was too absurd. Unfortunately, at this time in the abandoned front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, there was no time for him to think carefully about these questions of fauvism, symbolism, and Dali. Even if he wanted to think about it, the scene he saw after leaving the stone beam and stepping on the stone platform suspended in the middle of the snow-capped space did not allow him to think about it. Countless stone beams converged at this place, forming a natural stone platform. The stone platform floated tens of meters high in the air. The mountain wind whistled in from outside the platform, blowing the dust off the palaces and making them fall to the ground. There were countless piles of white bones outside the palace, and the floating dust fell through the gaps between the bones and did not fly up again. This process had been repeated countless times over the decades, so a layer of dust about a palm thick had accumulated under the eerie white bones, making people feel that these bones were lying in the river mud. Walking down the stone beam, Ning Ke first saw the eaves of the Devil's Doctrine, and then the white bones in the dust outside the Devil's Doctrine, and then he could no longer move his eyes away. When the Devil sect was destroyed, it was unknown what kind of tragic battle it had experienced. There were so many dead people in the periphery. As time passed, these corpses had already turned into white bones. Only the sharp cuts on them and the scattered bones in the surroundings could prove some of the cruelty in the past. Ning Ke helped Mo Shanshan pass through the pile of white bones, and came to the stone steps near the main hall, and found several complete corpses. The white bones inside the armor were protected by heavy armor, so they did not fall. Some of the skeletons still held their weapons tightly in their hands, and they did not let go for decades after they died. He had seen too many dead people in his life, and had seen crueler scenes, so he could still maintain his calm, and even squatted down to carefully study these complete corpses. However, Mo Shanshan had never seen such a horrible and cruel scene. Her beautiful face looked a little pale, and she clenched her hands tightly, unable to say a word. The weapons held in the hands of the dead were obviously extraordinary, and even after decades, they were still cold. Ning Ke noticed that there was a strong aura of talisman on the armor these people were wearing, and he was shocked. He thought that these people must have been the most powerful powerhouses in the Devil's Doctrine in the past. He stretched out his fingers and gently brushed off the dust on the armor, trying to see the talisman clearly. However, he did not expect that when his fingertips touched the surface of the armor, there was a crisp crack, and the seemingly indestructible armor instantly cracked. The crisp sound rang out continuously, and the armor on the former powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine in front of the stone steps all cracked, and the strong aura of talisman on it dissipated in the air, and could no longer be felt. The broken parts of the armor were smooth and shiny, and it was obvious that it had been directly cut by a sharp weapon like a sword. Who could use a sword to cut such a strong armor so easily? Moreover, the sword style had not been released, and it had been condensed in the armor for decades, and only suddenly burst out when Ning Ke touched it with his fingers today? Ning Ke had his own answer in his heart, and he remained silent. Mo Shanshan had been shocked earlier, and seeing his silence, she could see that he was somewhat calm. She could not help but feel a little ashamed, and also some other feelings. The two walked up the stone steps and pushed open the door of the hall. They went straight to the point, and saw a stone tablet that was as large as a mountain. This stone tablet seemed to be polished from a whole piece of rock, and its surface was extremely smooth. The wordless tablet? Mo Shanshan was the first to notice the stone tablet, and thought of the legends she had heard, and said in surprise. Ning Ke was vigilantly paying attention to the movements around him, and subconsciously asked, "What is the wordless tablet?" Mo Shanshan said in a daze, "The great divine priest of light who betrayed Haotian and founded the Devil's Doctrine once said that only time can hear those who know me, and those who sin against me. So when he died, he asked that there be no words left on the tablet, and let the world judge it. So the great divine priest of light is buried under this tablet?" Ning Ke looked up in shock, and then his expression became even more shocked. Because there were words on the wordless tablet. A line of arrogant words. Kuharan of the Academy destroyed the Devil's Doctrine here. Please vote for me. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 268. The words on the steel were deeply etched into the stone, with the sharpness left by the tip of a sword. Ning Ke looked at the row of words on the steel and slowly raised his eyebrows. He did not express any emotion and just looked at it silently for a long time. Then he left without saying a word, avoiding the scattered white bones at his feet to look at the side. He walked around the wordless steel a few times and finally went back to the front of the steel. He looked up at the steel again and raised his eyebrows as if they were about to fly up. He pointed at the words on the steel and said with a smile, "My youngest uncle wrote it." Mo Shanshan had once heard from her teacher that the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was destroyed by a senior sublime being. However, for some reason, the name of the sublime being did not spread. She had once guessed that it might be the senior of the Academy who disappeared after a glimpse of the world, but there was no evidence. This time, when she came to the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine in the wilderness, she saw Ning Ke's strange expression along the way, especially when he knelt in the stone array tactics. This made her even more certain of her guess. Now that she finally got the confirmation from Ning Ke, she still felt a little shocked and speechless. How powerful was the senior who destroyed the devil's doctrine with a single sword? She slightly frowned and pursed her thin red lips into a line. After a moment of silence, she looked at Ning Ke's frowning eyebrows and relaxed expression and said softly, "You seem to be very proud." Ning Ke nodded honestly. In order to resolve the mental impact brought by the steel inscription, he had looked around and found that the remaining aura of the dead powerhouses of the devil's doctrine was still strong. In particular, the white bones seemed to be harder than ordinary steel. He could not help but be shocked that so many powerhouses of the devil's doctrine were as vulnerable as the spring snow in front of youngest uncle's Haran sword. From this, one could imagine how terrifying youngest uncle's state was back then. In the back of the mountain of the academy, Ning Ke had already known that youngest uncle was definitely the world's most ferocious person through the indirect reaction of second brother and others. However, he still did not expect youngest uncle to be so ferocious. Could it be that when he broke through the front gate of the devil's doctrine, he had already surpassed the 5 states and achieved the king's way of the sage? As a disciple of the second floor of the academy, there was no reason for him not to feel proud to have such a youngest uncle. However, pride could not be eaten. Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan had come to the front gate of the devil's doctrine through untold hardships for the Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane and the aura left by youngest uncle. Now there are countless explanations as to why he did what he did back then, but the truth is that he came that year and did what he did. This room originally only had the silent pile of bones and the silent sword marks on the stone walls. It was so quiet that it seemed as if it did not belong to the human world. Therefore, the voice that suddenly sounded was very faint but very clear. This voice was very soft and very weak, with a sense of neutrality and peace. However, in the ears of Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan, not only was it very clear, but it was more like a thunder, which had nothing to do with the quiet environment. The verdant valley had disappeared from the depths of the vast Tianqi mountains for decades. The Daming Lake had disappeared for decades. The front gate of the devil's doctrine had also been isolated from the world for decades. According to the knowledge and speculation of the world, this place had long become a ruin and it was impossible for there to be any life. This was also what the two saw. There were only white bones and sword marks in the past. Who would have thought that there was actually someone alive here? Ning Ke was shocked speechless. He pulled Mo Shanshan behind him as fast as he could, and then he pulled his bow and arrow, aiming at the pile of bones with his most powerful weapon. Looking carefully, he found that there was a person in the pile of bones. The person was very old, so old that his hair and teeth were all gone. Only 2 strands of extremely long white eyebrows were fluttering on his face, almost reaching his shriveled chest. The person was wearing an extremely old monk's robe, which had long been tattered, hanging in front of his body like his eyebrows. The person was very thin, so thin that his chest and abdomen were sunken, and his limbs were as thin as firewood. There was no muscle or fat on his body, and his craggy bones were wrapped in a thin layer of skin. In particular, his deep eye sockets looked like 2 terrifying black holes. However, the gaze from the eye sockets was so compassionate and warm. Except for the thin and tight skin that had lost its elasticity and luster, the old monk was no different from the bones around him. Therefore, it was very difficult to find him sitting in the pile of bones. There were 2 very thin iron chains that pierced through the old monk's broken drum-like abdomen, and the other end was nailed to the hard wall behind him. The blood from decades ago had already turned black, smeared on the threads of the monk's robe. This scene was very strange, and the old monk in the scene was very terrifying. Ning Ke's fingers trembled slightly, and he almost let go of the bowstring and shot an arrow. Mo Shanshan covered her mouth tightly, and almost screamed out loud, if not for the compassionate and warm gaze of the skinny and terrifying old monk. "Who are you?" The old monk sighed softly and said, I thought that I would spend the rest of my life in the Long Atonement Day and would never see anyone again. I never thought that I would meet an old friend again. So, the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine is open? Then he looked at Ning Ke and said in confusion, You are this generation's world wayfarer of the Academy? It seems that you have just entered the see-through state 10 days ago. How can your state be so low? Is the Academy getting worse with each generation? Then, the old monk looked at Imo Shanshan and said with a sigh, Sitting on the Bone Mountain, I don't hear the morning drum and evening bell, and I don't know how many years have passed. I feel that I have only slept for a while, and now I have a successor. Ning Ke knew that he was the worst world wayfarer in the history of the Academy, and he was embarrassed to be pointed out by the old monk. But he thought that this old monk had been sitting at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine for decades, called youngest uncle Crazy Ku, and called the sage of calligrapher Young King. He must be a secluded sublime being. But who was this skinny old monk? To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 269. I strongly recommend the Fox God's new book, Fate and Kyo. The book was published a week ago, but I was sick and in a daze, so I forgot about it. I was wrong. The book number is 2226513. Speaking of which, Aunt Fox, no, the Fox God is Dodgy, my sister. This book is really well written, please support it. Older people were always worthy of respect. This old monk had sat on the mountain of bones and said that he was atoning for his sins for decades, so he was not an old man like Kuni Madi. Ning Ke put his bow behind him, but did not step forward. He looked at the skinny old monk from 100 feet away and said respectfully, I am indeed a student of the Academy. The front gate of the Devil's Doctrine opens in response to the heavens, but why do you say that all the bones on the ground are your sins? The old monk gave a dry and weak laugh and said, This is naturally a rather complicated story. Every time there was an adventure in the valley, one would hear a long and wonderful story when they met a strange person. Perhaps it was because he was expecting it. Ning Ke's reaction was very calm. He said softly, Please enlighten me, senior. The old monk was silent for a moment and said leisurely, When Madman Ku began to travel the world on behalf of the Academy, he wore an ordinary cyan steel sword on his waist, and no one dared to go against him. At that time, the Devil's Doctrine was still strong, arrogant, and bloodthirsty. Many innocent people were killed by the Devil's Doctrine, so naturally there was a storm when the two met. That storm was extremely bloody. The powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine who ran amok in the Central Plains were all killed by Madman Ku's sword. The West Hill Divine Palace and the righteous also took this opportunity to eradicate the Devil's Doctrine. Madman Ku stood on the peak of the storm, pointing at the sky and the earth with no respect in his eyes. Naturally, the old fogies of the West Hill Divine Palace did not like him. The Devil's Doctrine was forced into a corner by that storm, so they came up with a plan. They wanted to use the estrangement between the Academy and the Divine Hall to set up a war between them. One year, during the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival in the Lank Temple, cultivators from all the countries in the Central Plains gathered there. There were also dances, and the Devil's Doctrine massacred the front yard of the Lank Temple. They blamed the disaster on the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall. That was the beginning of the story. The old monk was as skinny as a ghost. When he slowly talked about the bloody events of that year, his tone and expression were as gentle as the spring breeze. In just a few words, he omitted the cruel scenes of the past. Ning Ke helped Imo Shanshan to sit against the wall. He looked at the old monk of the White Bone Mountain and thought about the old story that he had told. After a moment of silence, he said, Framing has always been classified as crude and clumsy. The old monk moved the corners of his drooping lips and smiled with difficulty. He looked at Ning Ke with a warm gaze and said with emotion, "The devil's doctrine in the outside world has probably been destroyed. Even if there are remnants, they are probably like rats crossing the street. So a child like you probably doesn't know what the devil's doctrine looked like in the past and what kind of terrifying power it possessed." It had been almost 2 years since Ning Ke left the city of Wei and began to come into contact with the world of cultivation. Other than the desolate man he had met a few days ago, he had only met a sword master who cultivated in the devil's doctrine at the entrance of the northern mountain road. In his eyes, that sword master was not very powerful, so naturally, he did not think that the devil's doctrine was very scary. The old monk's withered eyes slowly drooped, as if recalling the arrogance of the devil's doctrine in the past was a kind of damage to his old and calm state of mind. Then he continued in a gentle voice, "The devil's doctrine's cultivation method is the art of stealing from the heavens. Those who cultivate in the devil's doctrine are healthy and have no psyche power, which is enough to avoid the prying eyes of cultivators. Back then, the people of the devil's doctrine used this advantage to infiltrate the countries in the Central Plains. Some of them became senior statesmen in the imperial court, and some of them became leaders of large clans in the countryside. Their power was as dense as a net. Even the imperial center administration of the Tang Empire and the West Hill Divine Palace had people from the devil's doctrine." The old monk slowly raised his head and looked at him calmly. He said, "If it wasn't for the fear of the academy and the other unknown places, the devil's doctrine would have been able to change dynasties if they had gone all out. They didn't dare to act against heaven, but if they wanted to weave a conspiracy, how could they leave any loopholes? In fact, during the bloodbath in the Lank Temple, the devil's doctrine endured the pain of losing an arm and exposed the Grand Master who had been hidden in the judicial department of the Divine Hall for decades. Then, no one would doubt it." Ning Ke frowned and asked, "What does the bloodbath in the Lank Temple have to do with the academy and youngest uncle?" The old monk sighed. His sigh was full of pity. On the surface, the devil's doctrine bloodbath in the Lank Temple during the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival was aimed at the cultivators of the righteous sects, but in fact, it was aimed at the envoys of the Tang Empire. However, the devil's doctrine wanted to provoke the madness of Crazy Ku, so their real target was the poor girls from the Tang Empire who only knew how to dance. Upon hearing this, Ning Ke's heart suddenly tightened. He knew from second brother that Mistress Jian and youngest uncle were old friends. At this moment, he naturally thought that these dancers were from the House of Red Sleeves. However, Mistress Jian was still alive and well. Occasionally, when she met him, she would pull his ear and lecture him. Who had died in the past? Since the devil's doctrine had spared no expense to weave such a conspiracy, they naturally knew who they had to kill to make youngest uncle crazy enough to break into the Peach Mountain. It was just like if he returned to Lin 40th Street and suddenly saw Sang Sang lying in a pool of blood. All the evidence pointed to the Imperial Palace. Then, of course, he would not hesitate to break into the palace with a knife and arrow. He would break into the imperial study to tear the painting of Blooming on the opposite shore, and then chop His Majesty into 365 pieces, but youngest uncle did not break into the Peach Mountain. Instead, he destroyed the front gate of the devil's doctrine with a single sword. Ning Ke looked at the skinny old monk in the Bone Mountain and asked in confusion, what went wrong with the devil's doctrine's arrangement? The old monk was silent for a long time. Then, he laughed. His old and ugly smile hid a very complicated meaning. There were some emotions, some shock, some bitterness, and some pride. There was nothing wrong with the devil's doctrine's arrangement. At that time, the whole world thought that the judicial department of the Divine Hall had massacred the Lank Temple. Although they could not understand it, when the Lank Temple elder who lived in seclusion behind the Wa Mountain was forced to come out and said that the murderers were all from the West Hill, no one doubted it anymore. The old monk looked at him quietly and said, but Kuharan did not believe it. Ning Ke was puzzled and asked, why didn't youngest uncle believe it? The old monk said, Crazy Ku is not so easy to fool. Ning Ke was startled and shook his head. He said, "This reason is equivalent to no reason at all." The old monk sighed and said, "Back then, I once asked him the same question." Ning Ke listened carefully. The old monk smiled and said, "At that time, in this room," he said, "how can I be so easy to fool?" There was a moment of silence. "And then?" Ning Ke asked. He thought that every story should have a beginning and an end. The old monk was slightly surprised and asked, "The story after that, does the world still not know?" Ning Ke said, "The storyteller is different, so the content of the story will also change. This story has a very simple ending." The old monk's voice became even weaker. He said, "The devil's doctrine's methods could not fool Crazy Ku, so he naturally went to the front gate of the devil's doctrine. At that time, the devil's doctrine grandmaster thought highly of himself. There were many powerhouses in the devil's doctrine, but he was not too afraid. He thought that if you came, he would kill you. Crazy Ku naturally did not want to be killed by them, so he killed them all. He did not want to be killed by them, so he killed them all." It was a very simple narration, a very simple story, but it was a shocking past that had been buried in the dust of history. The simpler it was, the more shocking it was. After a few decades, only this old monk who was as skinny as a ghost and the countless skeletons that filled the main hall of the devil's doctrine could prove what had happened here in the past. Ning Ke looked at the old monk's sunken eyes and said, "Then why do you want to atone for your sins? What does this have to do with you?" The old monk raised his thin arms. The monk's robe on his arms was ragged, and his fingers slightly spread to form a madra. The joints under the skin of his 10 fingers could be seen horribly, like a pair of skeletal hands reaching out from the underworld. However, the madra formed by the skeletal hands faintly released a warm aura that calmed one's heart. It was as compassionate as 2 white lotuses that had descended from Haotian. The aura between the skeletal hands and the white lotus madra was unusually strong and condensed, but it did not have the slightest lethality. As the aura was gradually released, a layer of extremely warm luster suddenly appeared on the surface of the skeletal bodies around the old monk, as if they were about to come to life. Ning Ke stared at the 2 pairs of skeletal hands in front of the old monk's abdomen. He felt the aura and was shocked speechless. The power that the old monk displayed was too profound and unpredictable. It was the most powerful state that he had ever seen in his life. Mo Shanshan sat leaning against the wall and looked at the white lotus madra formed by the old monk's skeletal hands. She suddenly thought of a sentence that her teacher had mentioned when she was young, and could not help but look surprised. In the West, there was a lotus that fell into the world. It had 32 petals, and each petal was different. Each petal was a world. Atonement. Naturally, it was because this sin was mine. Because there was never any conspiracy of the devil's doctrine. This conspiracy was also mine. I've known that the priest of the judicial department is from the devil's doctrine for many years. I also know what they want to do, but I didn't do anything. I sat on the cold black chair, holding my chin, and quietly watched them do this. Then I was ready to find the right time to tell Kuharan. However, I still underestimated Kuharan. He did not need me to take out the evidence that I had carefully preserved. He knew that this was done by the devil's doctrine. This was good. So, I still sat quietly on the black and cold chair, holding my chin, and quietly waited for the arrival of the last moment. The old monk, who was as skinny as a ghost, sat among the piles of corpses. His skeletal hands formed the white lotus madra, and his eyes were gentle and compassionate. Ning Ke widened his eyes and asked in a trembling voice, "Who are you? What did you want to do back then?" This was the second time the old monk had heard this question. He slowly raised his head and looked at the sky. The iron chain that passed through his abdomen moved and made a crisp sound. The pain returned to his skinny face. The old monk looked at the sky. His deep-set eyes were still warm. The white lotus petals formed by his skeletal hands bloomed. Back then, I wanted to destroy the devil's doctrine. I wanted Kuharan to die. However, I did not expect that he would still be alive after I spent half of my life and effort to turn the entire devil's doctrine into a monstrous storm. As for who I am, the old monk retracted his gaze and looked at the two of them. He said gently, I am the priest of judgment. Divine Lord Lotus? An incredulous voice suddenly sounded from the back of the room. The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, who was dressed in rags, had arrived. She looked at the madra formed by the skinny monk in the middle of the mountain of bones. Her face was filled with disbelief and fanatical joy. Mo Shanshan almost shouted at the same time, Master Lotus? To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 270. Yi Hongyu suddenly appeared in the main hall of the Devil's Doctrine. Her left shoulder was covered with coagulated blood beads. Her red dress was torn and could not cover her body. She looked extremely embarrassed, but her eyes were still shockingly bright. Ning Ke did not know that she had relied on the qi in her chest to break all the stones in front of her and come to this place with great difficulty. However, he could guess what kind of hardships she had gone through just by looking at her. He could not help but admire her a little. Compared with the faint admiration, he was more nervous to see the Tao addict here. His right hand quickly reached behind him and held the hilt. He was ready to take advantage of the Tao addict's weakness to kill this terrifying enemy. However, he found that Yi Hongyu did not pay attention to him at all. Mo Shanshan, who was leaning against the wall, did not pay attention to him. The Tao addict and the calligraphy addict looked at the skinny monk in the Bone Mountain, intoxicated and speechless. To the east of the West Hill Divine Kingdom, there was a large round stone pillar near the sea. It was used to resist the dangerous waves on the sea. Behind the stone pillar was the Kingdom of Song. Perhaps because it was used to the rain and wind on the sea, this inconspicuous small country had contributed many great people to the world. Many priests in the Divine Hall came from the Kingdom of Song. The great Divine Priest of Light who had been imprisoned for many years also came from the Kingdom of Song. One night many years ago, a water lily bloomed in the backyard of an aristocratic family mansion in the capital of the Kingdom of Song. Along with the lotus, a baby boy was born. So the baby boy was named Lian Sheng. The young master of an aristocratic family, Lian Sheng, was not too amazing in his youth. Like the other young masters around him, he studied and took exams. Then he was awarded an official position and married a wife. However, his wife died of illness before he had a child. After his wife passed away, Lian Sheng built a grass hut near the grave. He was sad and withered and did not show his happiness for 3 months. One night, it was raining heavily outside the grass hut. Lian Sheng walked into the wind and rain and meditated for half a night. He came back in wet clothes and wrote a morning essay for his wife. Then he threw the brush into the new grass in front of the grave and floated away with a laugh. In the following years, Lian Sheng visited the mountains and many cultivation sections. At that time, the essay for his wife was spread to the world and caused many people to cry. He was already famous and all the sects treated him with respect, but they were not willing to talk to him about cultivation. In the autumn of the second year, Lian Sheng swam to the Hua mountain and took shelter in the Lank temple when it rained. That night, when he was lying quietly in the back hall, he happened to hear an old monk talking about Buddhism. After thinking about it for a day and a night, he walked back to the main door of the Lank temple and rang the bell. He pushed the door open and entered the room. He told the reception monk that he wanted to debate with the abbot of the Lank temple. The debate lasted for 32 days. Lian Sheng's eloquent words were like a lotus blooming in the clouds of Tile Mountain. During the conversation, there were faint cries of divine birds among the trees by the cliff, attracting the attention of countless famous scholars. The debate at the Lank Temple became another grand event after the Yulan Hungry Ghost Festival. The name of Master Lotus began to spread in the world. On the last day, the former Haotian hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace came from Peach Mountain and invited Lotus as a visiting professor in front of thousands of people. Unexpectedly, Lien Sheng smiled and declined. Then, he stroked his head in front of the elder of the Lank Temple in Tile Mountain. His black hair fell like a black lotus and his Buddhist heart became firmer. When the leaves fell in autumn, Lien Sheng left the Lank Temple in Tile Mountain. He crossed the river to the Ink Lake, went through the wild forest and entered the Yueluan Kingdom. Then, he disappeared in the vast wilderness in the northwest of the Yueluan Kingdom. No one knew where he went. A few years later, a monk returned from the wilderness. He walked around the palace and talked about karma and lucky chance with the nobles and commoners in the streets. He was well versed in Buddhism and had a good character. He was respected by the world. There was no Master Lotus in the world, but there was Master Lotus. At that time, the devil's doctrine was very powerful. It was hard to stop their infiltration of the countries in the Central Plains. Among them, there were two elders of the devil's doctrine who were the most mysterious. They secretly provoked the relationship between the sects of the countries and caused many bloody disasters. However, no one knew where the two elders of the devil's doctrine were hiding. That spring, Master Lotus was invited by the Haotian hierarch of West Hill to teach at the Divine Hall. During the banquet, the vice headmaster of the Revelation Institute spoke with contempt and dissatisfaction. Master Lotus strolled to the vice headmaster's seat in front of the hierarch lord and many powerhouses of the Divine Hall. Then, he killed him. The vice headmaster of the Revelation Institute was one of the two elders of the devil's doctrine. The hierarch of Haotian Taoism invited Master Lotus to the Divine Hall again. This time, he was not a foreign minister. Instead, he invited him to take up the position of the great divine priest of judgment that had been vacant for many years. Master Lotus said that it was not time yet and declined again. Master Lotus left the Peach Mountain and went to the Tile Mountain. He had been enlightened in the Tile Mountain. Now that he had returned from the outside world, he stayed in the Lank Temple to cultivate. He did not receive any visitors for 2 years and was gradually forgotten by the world. One day, a high-ranking sweeping monk in the Lank Temple suddenly died. The entire temple was shocked. Master Lotus walked out of the room and admitted that he had killed the sweeping monk. The sweeping monk was another elder of the devil's doctrine hidden in the Central Plains. Master Lotus lived in seclusion in the Tile Mountain for 2 years in order to investigate this matter. At that point, the two most mysterious elders of the devil's doctrine hidden in the Central Plains, Wind and Cloud, were both dead. Many of the devil's doctrine's evil and bloody plans were exposed. Master Lotus' name was known throughout the world. The White Tower Temple of the Yueluan Kingdom and the Lank Temple of the Tile Mountain remembered his kindness and honored him as the protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect. The West Hill Divine Palace rewarded him and invited him to read the 6 tomes of Arcane. Then, he was conferred the title of the Great Divine Priest of Judgment. Master Lotus became the first disciple of the Buddhism sect in history to become the Great Divine Priest of the West Hill Divine Palace. A few years later, the Grand Master of the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall was involved in the murder at the Lank Temple. Master Lotus was saddened by the death of his old friend and was willing to take responsibility. He refused to stay on the Peach Mountain and refused to be the Great Divine Priest. He left and went into seclusion. From then on, there was no Master Lotus in the world of cultivation. However, Master Lotus' name was still being passed down in this world until now. In the memories of the current world, Master Lotus was always shrouded in a layer of benevolence and mysteriousness. The benevolence was because of his actions, and the mysteriousness was because his dazzling life was too legendary. Master Lotus was good at writing and calligraphy. He studied the world and read old books quietly. There was no hindrance in his cultivation. He understood Tao in the Lank Temple and entered the knowing destiny state in a few years. His Dharma was profound and his Hautian Taoism cultivation method was equally profound. He was a great writer and calligrapher, a protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect and the great divine priest of judgment of the divine hall. Such a person who was willing to get close to all the beauty in the world, had the ability to understand all the laws in the world, and was brave enough to take on all the things in the world. He did it so perfectly. No one knew if he would appear again in the future. In many people's eyes, such a perfect person could not be acquired through cultivation. He could only be born with it. That was why the later generations left such an evaluation of him, who had disappeared without a trace. There was a lotus in the west that fell into the world. It had 32 petals. Each petal was different, and each petal was a world. His Buddhist name was Liancheng 32. He was like a white lotus that had drifted down to the mortal world. Every single lotus petal that bloomed like jade revealed a great ability, and it brought a trace of comfort to this ugly and filthy world. Ning Ke knelt down and kowtowed to the mossy sword mark on the stone in the great blockage formation outside the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. It was because he was kowtowing to his elder, the closeness in his blood, the admiration and yearning in his spirit. To the Tao addict and Mo Shanshan, Master Lotus was also a mountain that had been in their consciousness since the beginning of cultivation. Their blood flowed naturally with closeness and admiration. That was why they did not care about what Ning Ke was thinking at this moment. They did not have any desire to fight. They knelt down and kowtowed to the skinny old monk with great respect. Compared to the calligraphy addict, the Tao addict was obviously more excited. She was the Grand Master of the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall, and Master Lotus had once been the great divine priest of judgment of the Divine Hall. That meant that Master Lotus was like her Grand Master. More importantly, although the Judicial Department was the most powerful place in the West Hill Divine Palace, it had a bad reputation because of the prisoners. In the eyes of the world, it was always more gloomy than holy. For hundreds of years, only when the Divine Lord Lotus was in power could the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall suppress the evils of the Devil's Doctrine and gain the respect of the people. The elders in the Judicial Department could not forget the good times in the past. Therefore, in the eyes of the people in the Judicial Department, Divine Lord Lotus had a special status. She could not suppress the shock and excitement in her heart. Looking at the lotus handprint on the old monk's abdomen, she said with a trembling voice, "I am Yi Hongyu, the priest of the Judicial Department of the Divine Hall. Greetings, Divine Lord Lotus." Everyone in the Peach Mountain thought that Divine Lord Lotus had achieved great success in cultivation and had gone to serve Hautian. I did not expect that I would have the good fortune to meet the Divine Lord Lotus. Master Lotus did not expect to see a newcomer from the Judicial Department here. After a slight pause, he gently sighed and said, "I have said that time is unknown in the mountains. Now it seems that it is true. A clean and lovely girl like you has been dragged into the muddy water. What a pity." If it was anyone else who described the Judicial Department as a muddy water, Yi Hongyu would definitely make that person suffer a fate worse than death. However, at this moment, she did not have any reaction. This was because the one who said this was the ancestor of the Judicial Department. She did not dare to disobey him. More importantly, Divine Lord Lotus's voice was so gentle and kind, as if he was a grandfather who loved his little granddaughter. It made her feel warm and shy, which was rarely seen. The voices of the three addicts shook the world. Now, the Tao addict and the calligraphy addict were kneeling in front of the bone mountain like obedient children. Only Ning Ke was still standing straight. Mo Shanshan secretly pulled him a few times, but he pretended not to see it. Ning Ke was not like the calligraphy addict and the Tao addict, who had studied in sects since young and knew so many legends of the cultivation world. He had only entered the cultivation world with great difficulty 2 years ago. His senior brothers and sisters at the back of the mountain of the academy were not interested in telling stories. Therefore, his knowledge was too limited. He had never even heard of the name Lotus 32. Therefore, he naturally could not kneel in reverence like Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu. Hearing the 4 words, Divine Lord Lotus, he looked at the old monk sitting in the pile of bones and laughed. He said, "So you were once the great divine priest of judgment of the divine hall. No wonder you wanted to destroy the devil's doctrine." His smile gradually faded. He stared at the old monk's face and said, "But I still don't understand. Why did you spend half of your life to create such a plot to harm my youngest uncle? If it were me, I would not do this even if I had eaten too much." There was actually someone in this world who dared to use such a disrespectful tone to question the divine Lord Lotus. Yi Hongyu, who was kneeling in front of the bone mountain, turned around and looked at Ning Ke coldly. Her eyebrows were slightly raised and as sharp as swords. "Recently, I can only write slowly like this. My face is full of sweat. However, on Monday, no matter what, I have to shout with all my might, recommendation vote. Hurry up and vote. To be continued. If you like this work, you are welcome to come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation." Chapter 271. The old monk looked at Ning Ke warmly and said with a smile, "You don't seem to have heard of me." Ning Ke was slightly stunned and said, "Everyone should have heard of you." The old monk squeezed out a self-deprecating smile with difficulty on his face that was as skinny as a ghost. He said, "It may sound a little ridiculous, but I think that only a few decades have passed. The people of the younger generation should still remember my name." Ning Ke did not know what to say. He looked at Yi Hongyu's cold gaze and Mo Shanshan's helplessness. He thought to himself, could it be that Divine Lord Lotus was telling the truth? If you know my story, you should know that I comprehended Tao in Lenk Temple and served the chief monk of Xiankong Temple in preaching. I passed by the Divine Hall twice but did not enter. But in the end, I still became the great divine priest of judgment. However, I think you 2 girls would not know that I almost became the great priest of the devil's doctrine." The old monk looked gently at the 3 young people who could not hide their shock. He said slowly, "Since the devil's doctrine could infiltrate the countries of the Central Plains, the Buddhist sects of the Central Plains must have done something similar. Don't be too surprised. Looking back at my life, I have experienced too many things. Sometimes when I think about it in the middle of the night, I find it exciting. But if I think about it carefully, the proudest thing in my life is to have a friend like Kuharan. You ask me why I want Kuharan to die." The old monk looked at Ning Ke with a compassionate but slightly bitter expression, "Because he is my best friend. I know his earth-shattering abilities better than anyone else. When I was young, I accompanied him in the mountains for a few years. When I met him again, I was shocked to find that his abilities were getting stronger and he was getting closer to the darkness of the night. There are many kinds of friends, but I want to be a good friend. The more capable Kuharan is, the more I can't accept the change in his view of the world. That's why I'm going to drag him into this bloody storm at all costs, even if it will hinder my life's wishes. I'd rather he die with the devil's doctrine than fall into the devil's path." The room fell into a dead silence as they listened to the distant but still soul-stirring past. Yi Hongyu and Mo Shanshan lowered their heads subconsciously. The young talisman master had vaguely heard about it from her teacher. The Tao addict had lived in the West Hill Divine Palace for a long time, so she knew Mr. Ku's story better than most people in the world. Ning Ke had never heard of it. Through the indirect narration of his senior brothers and sisters in the back mountain, youngest uncle's image was always so lofty and proud, holding a cyan steel sword in his hand and swearing at the heavens and the earth, invincible in the world. How could he relate it to the image of the devil's doctrine? He raised his eyebrows, looked at Master Lotus and asked, "How did my youngest uncle join the devil?" The old monk sighed and said, "The devil comes from the heart. Anyone can become a devil." Ning Kai was not a typical Tang, but he still retained a lot of Tang's bearing in his bones. He did not believe this at all. He shook his head and said calmly and affirmatively, "My youngest uncle is invincible in the world. He is the most powerful in both strength and spirit. He does not need external help, so why would he cultivate the devil's doctrine?" The old monk said with a gentle expression, "He has never cultivated the devil's doctrine. Just as you said, he does not need the help of the devil's doctrine. But you do not know that a person like Kuharan is like the great divine priest of light 1,000 years ago. He will not be confused by external factors, but he will go astray because of his own thoughts. When his view of the world changes, he will start to turn his back on the glory of Haotian and walk towards the dark side." Ning Kai was stunned and said, "I don't understand." Hearing this honest or stupid answer, the old monk laughed and shook his head very slowly. Then, he gradually stopped laughing and looked at Ning Kai calmly and said, "Anyway, when he picked up that sword, he had already become a devil." Ning Kai asked, "Haran sword?" The old monk agreed. Ning Kai thought of the book, A Preliminary Exploration of Haran Sword, that he read in the old library and the sword-riding skill that second brother taught him in the back mountain of the academy. After a moment of silence, he shook his head and said, "Haran sword has nothing to do with the devil's doctrine." The old monk looked at him and said with a smile, "People only know about the Haran sword, but not the Great Spirit. If you have the opportunity to understand what the Great Spirit is in the future, you will probably understand why I said that." Ning Kai vaguely understood something. It was probably because youngest uncle's state was too strong in the past. In order to achieve a breakthrough or in philosophy, he created the Great Spirit, just like the great divine priest of light 1,000 years ago. However, the Great Spirit was something that Haotian did not allow to exist, just like the devil's doctrine. "I still don't understand." Ning Kai looked at the old monk in the White Bone Mountain and said with a smile, "Anyway, I do not believe that youngest uncle will become a devil." This was unreasonable. Anyway, whether it was the Tangs or the academy, they were best at being unreasonable. He thought to himself, after all, this is the past from decades ago. Even if you are the divine Lord Lotus, what can you do to me? Mr. Ku did become a devil later on. Yi Hongyu suddenly said. She turned back to look at Ning Kai and said, "In the end, he was punished by heaven and died." Ning Kai was stunned. Then, he jumped up like a wild cat whose tail had been stepped on. He scolded loudly, "Punish your mother." Hearing such vulgar words, Yi Hongyu strangely did not retaliate in anger. Instead, she looked at him with a complicated expression. After a moment of silence, she said, "I respect Mr. Ku and will spare your life for now." Looking at her reaction, Ning Kai suddenly understood that she was telling the truth. In the back of the mountain of the academy, second brother had said that youngest uncle had died, but he did not say how he died. Regardless of whether it was Master Yen Sei or other cultivators, no one had ever mentioned that there was a youngest uncle in the academy. It turned out that youngest uncle had used such a method to leave this world. Youngest uncle was second brother's idol. Second brother was Ning Kai's idol. Hence, youngest uncle was his biggest idol. It was a pity that he had only heard a few words in the wind. Hence, he did not have a clear image of youngest uncle. He could only vaguely feel proud from afar. Now that he had come to the wilderness and felt the proud and confident aura in the vast Tianxi mountains, youngest uncle became alive in his spiritual world. He followed the aura and passed through the mountains into the verdant valley. He broke through the realm and comprehended Tao by the lake. He confidently and firmly stepped over the stone array tactics and arrived at the front gate of the devil's doctrine. Here, he had finally heard youngest uncle's story and guessed the ending of the story. While he was shocked and sad, he suddenly realized that this was the natural course of the story. For a proud and confident person like youngest uncle, when there was nothing in the world that was worthy of his attention, he would naturally pull out the sword at his waist and point it at the sky above his head. However, could humans still not defeat heaven? Ning Ke stood silently in the mountain of bones and did not know what to say. The old monk sat quietly in the mountain of bones. From the moment he heard that Kuharan had joined the devil and was punished by heaven, he fell into absolute silence, just like how he had been for the past decades. A merciful light of Buddha appeared on his skinny, skeletal face. In the end, he still died like this. The old monk lowered his head and sighed. It was hard to tell whether it was a sigh of praise or sorrow. As he sighed, his body that was as skinny as a skeleton suddenly relaxed. Dust splashed out from the cracks of his bones or his tattered monk robe. After the dusty stories were told, it was time to talk about the love and hatred in the present world. Everything in the world was always repeating in such a boring cycle. Yi Hongyu's bare legs tightened slightly, and her right hand held onto the Taoist sword at her waist. Ning Ke suddenly woke up. He looked at her back and frowned slightly. He quickly said, "Master Lotus is in such a situation. Are you in a hurry to take action now? In my opinion, it is better to save him first." The old monk slowly raised his head and looked at the young man calmly and mercifully. He smiled and said, "I am a person who has bound myself. If I don't want to come out, who can help me?" Yi Hongyu knew that Ning Ke was trying to stall for time. She remained silent and held onto the hilt of her sword tightly. Just as she was about to turn around, she suddenly saw Divine Lord Lotus looking at her and shaking his head. She could not help but feel a chill in her heart and stopped what she was doing. The old monk smiled and said, "I have been hiding here for decades to atone for my sins. I have never left the outside world to fight and kill. Why must you children let me see all this? There are only bones in front of me, why kill again?" Yi Hongyu did not understand. Legend had it that when Divine Lord Lotus was still a Vedanta of the Buddhism sect, he had killed people in front of the Divine Hall's hierarch and other powerhouses. Occasionally, he would turn into a thunderous rage. How could he be such a kind and withered monk? However, looking at Divine Lord Lotus's deep eyes that were filled with kindness, warmth, and peace, even though she was mentally strong, she could not help but feel her body and mind relax. She could no longer have any competitive spirit and her right hand slowly let go of the sword hilt. The old monk said gently, "I never thought that the front gate of the devil's doctrine would open one day. Since you are able to enter the front gate at such a young age, you must be the most outstanding young people in the world. It is indeed a form of torture for young people like you to listen to these boring old stories. However, thinking that you are the future of the cultivation world, I really hope that you can control your temper and continue listening to this story." Upon hearing this, Yi Hongyu did not think much. She bowed and sat back on the ground. Mo Shanshan had been sitting quietly on the ground with her legs crossed. As long as Ning Ke did not have to risk his life against the Tao addict, he would not have any objections even if he was asked to tell the story for 3 days and 3 nights. Therefore, he said sincerely, "Master, please enlighten me." Yi Hongyu frowned slightly. She hated this person's shamelessness. Everyone in the world thought that the judicial department of the Divine Hall had done the murder in the Lank Temple. Only I and a few people in the Divine Hall knew that it was done by the Devil's doctrine. When we were about to find the right time to tell Kuharan, he had already seen through the truth. Of course, it was only the first layer of the truth. To be honest, I still do not know how he saw through it. That day, I saw him riding a donkey to the Daming Lake. I saw him disperse the lake water with a wave of his hand. I saw him cut through the stone array tactics with his sword. Chapter 272. The old monk sighed and said, "That autumn, when I was debating on Hua Mountain, the hierarch came to see me. Another autumn, I left the central plains for the wilderness. People thought that I was living in seclusion in the Lank Temple, but that was not the case. During that period, I was invited by the Divine Hall to cultivate in the Devil's doctrine. That was the reverse infiltration of the Central Plains." Hearing this, Ning Ke was slightly shocked. He wondered if this old monk had almost become the leader of the Devil's doctrine. It was a good plan for the West Hill Divine Palace to invite him, Lotus 30, to infiltrate the Devil's doctrine. This person was trusted by the Devil's doctrine and even climbed to a high position. He must be one of the best in the world in terms of state, means, and will. The old monk did not know what Ning Ke was thinking. He looked at the dusty stone walls in the room with a gentle expression, as if he was looking at the clean main hall of the Devil's doctrine decades ago. He continued slowly, "In the world's impression, the Devil's doctrine is full of evil and damned scum. The truth is not far from it. Those in the Devil's doctrine kill innocents, kidnap children, and force them to cultivate devil's skill. Countless people die every year. But is the Devil's doctrine a piece of iron? When the Devil's doctrine was at its peak, it was divided into 7 schools and 28 schools. Each school had different cultivation ideas and even the idea of entering the human world. Some schools were like Buddhist monks who did not interact with the human world. How could they do evil? The old monk retracted his gaze and looked at the 3 of them calmly. He said, "The Devil's doctrine is like any other sect. There are good and bad people. I admit that most of them are bad people, but there are always good people. However, when the sword broke the stone array tactics and killed its way into the front gate, who knows if those who died were good or bad? When Kuharan killed his way into the front gate of the Devil's doctrine, I was in this mountain." The old monk lowered his head slowly. His neck made a dry sound as if it would fall at any time. He said, "I lived in the Devil's doctrine for many years and naturally had many old acquaintances. I knew that some were greedy, some spoiled their concubines, and some loved to be their children's horses. On that day, everyone I knew died. I infiltrated the Devil's sect with the goal of destroying the Devil's sect. Those people died in front of me one by one. I should be happy, but I don't know why, but I just can't feel happy." Looking at those familiar faces being sliced in half, the children who used to jump on my knees being sliced in half, the blood spreading out of the temple, dyeing the lower half of the wordless monument red, flowing down the stone steps, and finally dripping slowly into the pitch-black abyss along the stone beams that you should have seen. I suddenly realized that I was very sad. Ning Ke frowned slightly and said, "Enough." The old monk looked at him mercifully and shook his head slowly, saying, "This is not your youngest uncle's killing karma. I am recalling those scenes not to blame him. I just want to understand, what exactly is a demon? Is the Devil's doctrine, which slaughters the innocent, the devil? Or is the murderous Kuharan the devil? Because I was worried that Kuharan would become a demon and cause him to kill so many people, would that make him become a demon instead? Or could it be that I, the one who secretly arranged everything behind the scenes, was the real demon?" Looking at the blood on the ground, I began to ask myself some questions. The old monk's voice gradually became doubtful. This kind of doubt was the doubt of standing on the Peach Mountain and looking at the sky. It was the doubt of standing in the ruins and feeling the vicissitudes of history. It was the doubt of oneself and this world. How should we differentiate the right path and the devil path? What exactly is a demon? If we are to differentiate based on ideology and morality, then the Devil's doctrine is a demon who slaughters the innocent. Then who doesn't kill in the long road of cultivation? The Buddhism sect says that all living beings are equal. If we are to become a demon by killing people, then what about butchers who kill pigs? When we were young, we picked up stones to kill stray dogs on the road. When we gnawed on pigs' trotters until our hands were covered in grease and we tore off the strong tendons with relish, did we ever think that this was the flesh of a pig? Did we become a demon when we were doing these things? If we are to differentiate based on birth, the devil's doctrine originated from the great divine priest of light 1,000 years ago. According to historical records, the great divine priest of light was virtuous, compassionate, and brilliant. How could he be innately evil? The devil's doctrine originated from the Piming hand scroll of the 7 tomes of arcane of Haotian Taoism. It was originally a branch of Haotian Taoism, so why did it become a demon? The old monk looked at the 3 young people in front of him quietly and said softly, "The front gate of the devil's doctrine has been destroyed, and blood flows like a river. After that day, I have been trapped here to atone for my sins for decades. I have been thinking about this question for decades." Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan were silent as they pondered over the words of the previous generation's eminent monk. Yi Hongyu suddenly raised her head and said without hesitation, "Divine Lord Lotus, you are wrong. The reason why the devil's doctrine became a demon has nothing to do with ideology and morality, nor does it have anything to do with one's birth. It is because the cultivation method itself is an evil one. Haotian sent divine light to the world, bestowing warmth and light. Only then can all living things in the world grow, and only then can there be a flow of aura between heaven and earth. However, the cultivation method of the evildoers of the devil's doctrine forcefully snatched the chi of vitality from nature, and recklessly absorbed the heaven and earth into their bodies. It is equivalent to stealing the light of heaven's benevolence. If these evildoers are allowed to grow stronger, the aura of heaven and earth will gradually dry up, and the world will be destroyed. What then? This kind of cultivation method blasphemes Haotian and overturns the heaven and earth. It is a great disrespect, and that is why it became a demon. The young girl's voice was exceptionally firm and clear at this moment. This matter involved the difference between Taoism and the devil. Even when facing the divine Lord Lotus whom she respected and admired, she remained calm and unyielding. She said in a low voice, "The difference between Taoism and the devil is not in ideology or bloodline, but in the difference between survival and destruction of the world. It is like black and white, light and darkness. How can they be compatible? Divine Lord, you are wrong." Yi Hongyu's crisp voice helped Mo Shanshan to dispel the doubts in her heart. She nodded slightly and thought that what she said was true. The difference between Taoism and the devil was whether one had good or evil intentions towards the world. In the past, Ning Ke did not understand why the cultivators of the West Hill Divine Palace, the Buddhism sect, and the Tang Empire would treat the devil's doctrine as enemies when it was mentioned. It was so resolute that it made one's heart palpitate. Today, Yi Hongyu's words finally made him understand the reason behind it. The devil's doctrine's cultivation method absorbed the chi of heaven and earth for one's own use. The higher one's state, the more chi of heaven and earth one could absorb. If the devil's doctrine was allowed to develop in the world until everyone started cultivating the devil's doctrine, the entire world's chi of heaven and earth would be sucked dry. By then, the world would be destroyed. It was like a flock of sheep on the grassland. If they ate all the grass on the grassland would become a desert and the sheep would naturally die. He finally realized that the reason why the devil's doctrine was viewed as an enemy by the world was because of an environmental problem. The Tao addict, the calligraphy addict, and the flower addict were the 3 addicts in the world. If they were in another environment that Ning Ke was familiar with, they would be those intelligent girls who studied both arts and sciences and shamelessly studied until 3 o'clock every night. These girls were usually stubborn and crazy. They loved to say things like, "I love my teacher, but I love the truth more." The Tao addict, Yi Hongyu, was like all the cultivators in the world like Ning Quebec. She had once doubted the difference between the world and the devil's doctrine. She had thought about it and even reflected on it. However, she was different from other cultivators. She was not limited by the world's fixed views and gradually stopped thinking about these problems. She did not let her hatred towards the devil become a part of her instincts. Instead, she constantly increased her understanding of the world and learned from it. She finally came up with her own views. This kind of thinking was 1,000 times more resolute than the beliefs of those ordinary cultivators. That was why, even though she was extremely respectful towards the divine Lord Lotus, she still insisted on her own views and refused to bow down. That was because she believed that this was the truth. Her views were neither hypocritical nor pretentious. She did not talk about lucky chance, karma, or killing. She only talked about benefits and benefits. She talked about whether the devil's doctrine and the Taoism doctrine would bring benefits or harm to the world. Because it was simple, it was certain, and it was extremely difficult to refute. However, Master Lotus was, after all, Master Lotus. He only used a simple sentence to make Yi Hongyu's seemingly unbreakable point of view relax and waver. This was because Master Lotus was more knowledgeable and had spent more time to study and reflect. Furthermore, Yi Hongyu's point of view was not tied tightly enough. I have said before that I once lived in the devil's doctrine for a period of time. I did not find the Ming hand scroll of the tomes of arcane, but I came into contact with many skills of the devil's doctrine. I believe that no one in this world has a deeper understanding of the devil's doctrine than me. The old monk looked at Yi Hongyu with a gentle expression and said, I had the same thoughts as you in the past. However, after I saw the cultivation of the people in the devil's doctrine, saw their birth and death, and saw their relationship with heaven and earth, my thoughts gradually changed. That was because I was the same as you now. We have both forgotten a very important problem. The people in the devil's doctrine have strong bodies and long lives, but they will still die in the end. When they die, the chi of heaven and earth that they have cultivated for decades or even hundreds of years will return to heaven and earth as their bodies stiffen and die. After a moment of silence, the old monk smiled and said, once you understand this, you will understand that the devil's doctrine does not want to build another world. Instead, they want to open up a space that belongs to them. That space could be a lake, a mountain, or a beautiful grassland. However, no matter which it is, this space will eventually become a part of heaven and earth. Both of us were born in this world and grew up bathed in the divine light of Haotian. We cultivated and breathed. In the end, our bodies turned into ashes and our aura dissipated. Both of us returned to the embrace of Haotian. Perhaps our paths are different, but our starting and ending points are the same. Then, can you tell me, what is the difference between the devil's doctrine, Taoism sect, and Buddhism sect? Yi Hongyu was slightly stunned and could not answer. She felt that there was something wrong with Divine Lord Lotus's words. However, she could not pinpoint the problem in such a short period of time. The old monk looked at her and said calmly, I know what you are thinking. The people in the devil's doctrine will die. Then, they will not cause any harm to this balanced and great world. If they can live forever after joining the devil's doctrine, then Taoism, or should I say, your vigilance and enmity will be valid. However, when has there ever been an immortal in this world? Yi Hongyu slowly sat on her lap. Her black hair flowed down from her shoulders and she looked a little lonely. These words had a huge impact on her Taoist heart. Usually, if she heard someone saying that Taoism and the devil's path had the same goal, she would definitely laugh coldly and draw her sword to kill them. However, the person who said these words today was the Divine Lord Lotus whom she respected. More importantly, there was nothing wrong with Divine Lord Lotus's words. The old monk seemed to be able to sense her uneasiness and faint fear. He looked at her with a compassionate gaze and sighed softly. Then, he raised his right hand with difficulty and stretched it towards the sky. His fingers shone brightly. Yi Hongyu looked over in shock. Ning Ke and Emo Shanshan looked over in confusion. The three of them could feel the holy aura released from the old monk's skinny fingers at the same time. In order to atone for my sins, I set up the confinement in this room. This confinement is the world outside of my body. The chi of heaven and earth here is thin and uncontrollable. However, it can be slowly absorbed into the body through the accumulation of time. At this moment, the chi of heaven and earth is flowing in my skinny body. That is the world inside my body. When these two worlds come into contact, a wonderful state is born. This is because the confinement is a Taoist technique and the circulation of qi in the body is a devil's skill. When Taoist technique and devil's skill meet. The old monk looked at the holy radiance that lingered around his fingers quietly and said calmly, "This is the divine skill." Trying to save the manuscript. I'm not used to it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 273. The radiance around the skinny fingers gradually faded, and the flame that had no heat swayed. It was like a small oil lamp in the night wind, or a fishing fire in a storm. It seemed like it could be extinguished at any time, but it would never be extinguished. Yi Hongyu looked at the holy radiance between Master Lotus' fingers, and her eyes were filled with confusion. Mo Shanshan's expression was no better than hers, and was filled with shock. They could clearly feel the holy aura contained in the light, and could not calm down as they pondered over Master Lotus' words. Ning Kei's state of cultivation and knowledge was not as good as the two girls, so he was not as shocked as they were. He was only surprised that such a mysterious divine skill did not seem threatening at all. It was as if it did not exist in reality. The radiance between the old monk's skinny fingers was transparent and warm. It did not make one's eyes feel any burning pain, nor did it spread a scorching heat. Instead, it shone like the sun in the heavens and earth, revealing an indescribable supreme state. Mo Shanshan murmured, "If Taoism and the devil are interlinked, one can enter divinity?" The old monk looked at her with a smile, and his eyes were filled with admiration. He said, "I have been thinking about the difference between Taoism and the devil for decades. I have used Taoism to form a world outside of my body, and used devil's power to form a world within my body. I have finally found a possibility, which is what you said." Upon hearing these words, Yi Hongyu finally woke up from her shock. She thought of something. Regardless of whether the connection between Taoism and the devil could lead to divinity, in order to attempt such an attempt, one would first have to join the devil. She stared blankly at the old monk in the Bone Mountain and felt that her judgment was a little disgraceful. How could Divine Lord Lotus, you guessed correctly. I have indeed entered the devil. The old monk who was as skinny as a ghost sat on the Bone Mountain. The air had been dry for decades, and only the cracks on the roof that the Bone Mountain pointed at had a hint of moisture. The moisture had accumulated for a long time, and it finally condensed into a drop of water. The old monk slowly raised his head and opened his mouth slightly. The drop of water dripped into his dry lips, and then turned into a smile on the old monk's skinny face. The smile was compassionate, calm, and admirable. The old monk looked at her and said with a smile, "Back then, I was worried that Kuharan would enter the devil. I did not expect myself to enter the devil in the end." At this moment, Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu's consciousness were greatly shaken. They were a little muddle-headed and each was immersed in their own thoughts. Only Ning Kei was still paying attention to the old monk's every move. Stepping into the Devil's Hall, Ning Kei met this legendary figure who had bound himself to atone for his sins for decades. Ning Kei had many questions in his heart. How did Master Lotus survive after not eating or drinking for decades? Later, when he saw that Mo Shanshan and Yi Hongyu did not have such doubts, he thought that this master's state had long surpassed the imagination of mortals and could abstain from eating. At this moment, looking at the drop of water condensed from the wetness in the stone crack on the roof falling into the old monk's dry lips, he could not help but be slightly startled. He thought that the old monk had a very clear grasp of the rhythm of the water dripping from the stone crack. Who knew how many times he had repeated it over the decades, or how many drops of water had he missed? It made his heart ache. How could he be so proficient? The scene of the wetness in the stone crack supporting a legendary figure who had sat to atone for his sins for decades would probably make anyone feel pity and respect for him. However, Ning Kei's heart was as hard as stone and refused to tremble. Instead, he raised his eyebrows slightly. If it was to atone for his sins, why did he have to beg for life? If it was to use the pain of life to respond to the severity of one's sins, why would he feel pain from missing a drop of water, and thus raise his head to receive the water drop as an instinctive reaction? When Ning Kei was thinking about these things, Master Lotus had already started to debate with Yi Hongyu and Mo Shanshan about the highest and faraway scenery of the cultivation world. He could not help but frown. He thought that Master Lotus's debate in the Lank Temple back then was so exciting that the Divine Hall Hierarch came to visit. He was definitely not someone like Prince Long Qing could be compared to. This Devil's Hall must have been bored to the point of debating with himself every day for decades. How could they win against him? Indeed, as time passed, the old and compassionate voice was the only thing left in the room. If there is truth in the world, it should be understood through debate. What is the pursuit of cultivators? If we are searching for the way to understand the world and the power to change the world, then how can there be good and evil in power itself? Only those who use power will be able to differentiate between good and evil. A knife can be used to cut vegetables, carve radishes, or kill people. A stone can be used to admire, or to build a house, or to kill people. A lake can be used to breed fish, or to go boating, or to kill people. A mountain can be used to climb, or to build a house, or to kill people. Everything in the world can be used to please people, or to kill people. But everything is innocent. Only humans are the spirit of all things, and they give everything souls and uses. Therefore, the word sin can only be applied to humans. The difference between Taoism and the devil lies in the method and the path. Just like everything in the world, how can we incriminate them? The only thing that can be sinned is still humans. The old monk's words were not difficult or obscure at all. He did not use mysterious words to cover his words with a layer of mystery. He slowly explained these simple and plain principles, crushing the cultivation world that he knew for the three young people to listen to. The old monk's voice was weak, and his slightly hoarse voice was full of love for the world and compassion for all living beings. His tone was calm but convincing, and it could be said that any words he said were profound truths. Ning Kei did not listen carefully, but he was unknowingly attracted by the old monk's words. He sat on the ground and began to listen attentively. As the benevolent voice entered his ears, his tense mind since coming to the wilderness gradually relaxed, and his body also became relaxed. The room in the Devil's Palace seemed to have accumulated decades of loneliness, isolated from the world, and extremely quiet. Only the old monk's voice slowly bloomed like a lotus flower, gently echoing. These voices and words eventually turned into lotus petals that turned into spring water, reverberating between the walls and the soul. Wave by wave, it spread over and made people feel warm and comfortable. Among the corpses, there was a skeleton with half of its dried meat left. The skeleton raised its head to the sky, its withered bony claws stretched out behind its head like a cushion, and its fleshless right leg rested on its left knee, as if it was listening quietly and happily. It was not known whether it was because of the wind blowing or the dripping water, but the skeleton's head would occasionally nod twice, as if it was in agreement. After an unknown amount of time, the teaching and explanation that reverberated between the room and the soul slowly stopped. The old monk looked at the three young people with a gentle expression. Looking at their thoughtful expressions, he smiled and said, "The front gate has opened, and the world will definitely be troubled again. Carefully calculating, it is probably time for me to leave." Yi Hongyu looked up in shock, not knowing what to say. The old monk looked at his skinny hands that had unknowingly formed a lotus seal. After a moment of silence, he said indifferently, "My life, in the eyes of the secular world, is already considered wonderful. I was born in Buddhism and advanced to Taoism, but eventually followed the devil's sect. Now that my life is coming to an end, I think that the great divine priest who founded the devil's doctrine 1,000 years ago said that those who know me will sin against me. Only time can hear me, and I can't help but feel that it is meaningless. But, who can really be completely unconcerned about life and death? Even if you have already escaped from death, who cannot have a trace of nostalgia for the world? Do you want to leave some traces in this world? Even I am the same." The old monk slowly raised his head and looked at the three people in front of him. He smiled and said, "I have cultivated in 3 sects and have been trapped for decades to atone for my sins. I dare not say that I have achieved great success, but I have gained something. I would like to pass on the little power in this body and my knowledge of this world. I wonder who among you is willing to accept my mantle." It was rumored that the grand cultivators who had cultivated to the extreme could even vaguely feel the time when they would leave because they had a deep enough understanding of the world. Master Lotus had been trapped in the front gate of the devil's doctrine to atone for his sins. He had suffered in hunger and suffering for decades, and finally encountered the reopening of the front gate and the younger generation of disciples. This kind of opportunity might be the wedge between life and death. Therefore, when they heard that he was about to leave this world, although the three of them were shocked, they were not completely unprepared. However, when they heard that Master Lotus had decided to pass on his mantle, even Ning Ke, who had been forcing himself to stay calm, could not help but be shaken. Yi Hongyu's sense of perception was even more unsettled. She clenched her fists tightly and could not say a word. The two most important things in life were the way to understand the world and the ability to change the world. The three of them had been listening to Master Lotus's method of understanding the world for a long time. The ability to change the world was naturally power and state. There was no such thing as passing on power in the right way of cultivation. Only the most powerful people in the devil's doctrine would pass on their power to their chosen successor through enlightenment before their lifespan ended. Master Lotus should be using this method to pass on his mantle. What kind of person was Master Lotus? Ning Ke had never heard of him before, but he was very clear now. He was well versed in Taoism, Buddhism, and the devil's doctrine. He had been to 2 unknown places and had been the protector of the front gate of the Buddhism sect. He had been the great divine priest of judgment of the divine hall and had almost gotten the position of the leader of the devil's doctrine. He was qualified to travel and be friends with youngest uncle. He had cultivated both Taoism and the devil's doctrine to the divine skill after staying in the Forbidden Mountain for decades. Such a person was, of course, the most powerful existence in the world. If he could inherit his mantle, how many years would he have to struggle on the long and difficult path of cultivation? How strong would he be able to get? What kind of magical world would he come into contact with? More importantly, Ning Ke was very clear that if he could inherit his mantle, perhaps it would not take long before he could tear General Xiahou, Princely Pei Yan, and even the shadows hiding behind them into pieces. He did not need to rely on the power of the academy, nor did he need to put his senior brothers and sisters in the back of the mountain in a dilemma. He could easily take revenge for the hatred that he had been guarding for more than 10 years. His parents who had loved him dearly in this life lying in a pool of blood, his young playmate who had been trampled to death, the chopper that was stained with black blood, the 2 people who had fallen in the woodshed, Darky who stood by the grey wall on a rainy day, and the innocent villagers who had died tragically in Darky's hometown. All of these images appeared in his mind at this moment, looking at him quietly. In fact, the hatred for the massacre of his family had already faded away in his heart. However, he was afraid of this indifference, so he wanted to engrave the hatred deep into his bones. This hatred, which had already changed its flavor, had become the most important spiritual support in Ning Kei's life. This support, when mixed with the innate greed for power, had become the most irresistible temptation. This kind of temptation was like an invisible hand, slowly lifting his body from the ground, urging him to move his feet with difficulty, walking towards the Bone Mountain. Suddenly, he stopped his steps. To avoid being beaten, I'll show you a silly smile. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 274. Ning Kei only needed to take a few more steps forward and climb up the Bone Mountain to receive Master Lotus' caress. Then, he would inherit all his achievements and become a top powerhouse in the world. He would then understand the wonders of Devil's doctrine and enter the state of God. However, this meant that he would have to accept the Devil's doctrine's genuine qi. When Taoism and the Devil were connected, one could enter the state of God. This sounded wonderful. However, under the luxurious robe, the naked reality was still the same as before. Enlightenment was a secret method of the Devil's doctrine. It could not be passed on through enlightenment or the state of psyche power. It could only exist in reality. The qi of heaven and earth that was absorbed from nature was not the Devil's doctrine. To enter the state of God, one must first enter the Devil's doctrine. In the secluded hall, Master Lotus could gently talk about the Devil's doctrine. However, in the real world outside the mountain, the Devil's doctrine was still an evil existence that could not be tolerated in the world. It was an evil that all the countries and sects in the Central Plains wanted to destroy. Ning Kei was the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy. Yi Hongyu was the most beloved Tao addict among the younger generation of the West Hill Divine Palace. However, even people of their status would be abandoned by the whole world once they were discovered to have entered the Devil's doctrine. Just like this magnificent mountain range in the north of the wilderness. He would enter the Devil if he took a few more steps. How could he take that step? However, the temptation of inheriting Master Lotus's mantle and becoming a powerhouse with unparalleled power and cultivation was so fresh and powerful. How could he let go of such an opportunity? Ning Kei felt that his legs were as heavy as a few thousand taels of silver. He could not move an inch. Yi Hongyu's ears seemed to still be reverberating with the gentle and compassionate voice of Divine Lord Lotus. Her eyes were a little empty. Occasionally, there would be a glimmer of determination, but it would instantly turn into a struggle of pain. Just like Ning Kei, her spiritual world was also in an extremely unstable but relaxed state. Her thoughts were swaying with Master Lotus's teachings. She was swaying between what she had learned from Haotian Taoism and pure logic. Inheriting the mantle of Divine Lord Lotus was an unimaginable temptation to any cultivator. However, if it was just this temptation, it would not be enough to make her, who had a strong Taoist heart, interested in the Devil's doctrine. However, deep in her heart, she could not refute Divine Lord Lotus' point of view. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that it made sense. The eyebrows on Yi Hongyu's beautiful face were tightly furrowed. She looked like she was in great pain. She stretched out her left hand and grabbed her plump and soft breasts. Her fingers dug in deeply, as if she was trying to dig out her uneasy heart. Because she used too much strength, the wound on her left shoulder, which had been injured by several arrows, burst open again. Blood slowly flowed out. She murmured, "Is there really a third path?" Mo Shanshan, who was kneeling on the ground, had turned extremely pale at this moment. Her lips were pursed into a straight line, and her beautiful ink-like eyes were unable to focus at all, appearing extremely scattered. Master Lotus did not rush them, nor did he show any impatience. He looked at them calmly and gently. There was a faint benevolent smile on his skinny face. Perhaps he hoped that they could cross the threshold themselves and make their own choice. The strong spiritual impact caused by the difference between Taoism and the devil caused Ning Ke and the other two to fall into a painful spiritual struggle. This kind of pain caused their minds to be absent-minded and unstable. However, it was accompanied by a very clear and relaxed state of mind. Gradually, the pain and struggle began to flow away like water. The aura that lingered in their sense of perception turned into warm spring water, and the clear and relaxed stable state of mind once again occupied their bodies. The negative emotions like fear and struggle gradually faded away. The three of them instinctively felt very safe. Master Lotus was as pure as a lotus. There was no need for him to deceive them into joining the devil, nor would he have any ulterior motives towards them. If such a peerless powerhouse wanted to hurt them, he would not need to spend so much effort. The real reason that made them calm and relaxed was still the temptation. The temptation of inheriting the legacy of the previous powerhouses, the temptation of understanding the original truth of the world, and the temptation of merging Taoism and the devil to enter divinity. This temptation was the grassland, the starry sky, the sweet taste of milk cakes when they were young, the arrogant aura of standing on the peak of the mountain, and the possibility of writing one's name on the modeled city wall for the future generations. The door of temptation was slowly opening in front of them. Behind the door was an unfamiliar, fresh and fertile grassland. As long as they were willing, they could lie on this green grassland that was as soft as a blanket, and look at the beautiful starry sky that they had never seen before. They could enjoy everything quietly. Among the three of them, Yi Hongyu's state was the highest, and she had the deepest understanding of cultivation. She had seen those truly powerful powers before, and she stubbornly and focused on pursuing them. Hence, she felt the greatest temptation at this moment. Suddenly, she heard the creaking sound of the broken wooden bed shaking. She saw her legs that were as thin and weak as reed sticks when she was young. There was no chi of heaven and earth around the old monk at all. There were many ways to isolate the chi of heaven and earth in the world. However, there was only one way to make the chi of heaven and earth disappear completely. Even with Yi Hongyu's vast knowledge, she only knew of one way, the real confinement. Yi Hongyu was naturally very familiar with the confinement of the judicial department. She was also one of the few people who had seen the confinement that the great divine priest of judgment had set up. However, the confinement that the great divine priest of light had trapped for more than 10 years was not as powerful as the one in front of her. Feeling the release of the psyche power and the weakness in her body, she lowered her head and knelt on the white bones. Looking at the craggy white bones, her gradually blurred vision finally gave birth to a look of despair. The white bones as the fence and the dried corpses as the fence. It was such a powerful and terrifying confinement. The stone in my chest was slightly released and I felt less suffocated. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 275. When the Tao addict was captured, Ning Ke instinctively wanted to escape with Mo Shanshan, as far as he could. However, he did not do so. Instead, he prepared to use the primordial 13 arrows to solve all of this, as he knew that he would not be able to escape. When he pinched the cold tail of the talisman arrow, the old monk's skinny palm had already started to emit a strong aura. When he pulled the iron bow to its fullest, Yi Hongyu had already lowered her head and collapsed. He saw the despair in Yi Hongyu's eyes, as well as Master Lotus's emotionless and cold gaze. Mo Shanshan was startled awake by him from the illusion, and she sobered up in an instant. Her beautiful black hair that was like a waterfall suddenly fluttered behind her, and her right hand trembled in the air. She knew that the three of them were in a hopeless situation, so she immediately used her strongest half-divine talisman. Facing such a powerful double attack, the old monk who was sitting in the bone mountain was still expressionless. He only glanced at them, and his gaze fell into the eyes of the two. With just one glance, Ning Kai felt an unbearable pain in his head, as if second brother's wooden club was hitting his head at a speed that could not be seen by the naked eye. He blacked out and loosened his fingers. Mo Shanshan felt that her chest and abdomen were suddenly cut open by a sharp blade. The stone array tactics that she had accumulated in the big array outside the front gate all gushed out. However, there was no joy, only endless pain. Her fingers that were drawing the talisman froze. The talisman arrow left the bow like a black shadow. At this moment, Ning Kai's sense of perception was in a mess and he could not control it at all. The iron arrow shot out with a swoosh and shot into a corner of the Devil's Hall. It directly broke the huge stones there and piled them up into a corner of the Devil's Hall. The divine talisman that was brewing between Mo Shanshan's slender fingers instantly became dim and weak. It was like a small oil lamp in a room with no air circulation, and suddenly extinguished by a strong gust of wind. Blood spurted out from their mouths at almost the same time. They fell to the ground weakly and could no longer stand up. Master Lotus's expression was indifferent and emotionless as he looked at the two who fell to the ground with blood spurting out from their mouths. His deep-set eyes were dark and cold. They were as thin as rice grains and looked extremely demonic. His shriveled chest and abdomen seemed even more hollow than before. It seemed like a casual glance, but in fact, it contained an extremely terrifying state. The old monk had been imprisoned for decades, and it took him decades to condense his psyche power again. Master Lotus looked expressionlessly at Yi Hongyu who was kneeling in front of him. He slowly stroked her hair with his palm, as if he was a gentle lover. Then, he smiled. His smile was still as gentle and kind. With such a gentle and compassionate smile, he leaned over and lowered his head against Tao Addict's slightly cold cheek. As if he was kissing or whispering, he gently touched her left shoulder with his lips and began to suck gently. His aged lips were like leeches greedily sucking on the young girl's delicate naked skin. His thin and shriveled cheeks were moving rhythmically. Fresh blood slowly entered his lips, moisturizing his throat that had been thirsty for many years and began to nourish his organs that had not felt any warmth for many years. After a while, the old monk raised his head and looked at the young girl in his palm. His eyes were gentle and compassionate. A faint but exquisite aura of Buddhism appeared on his face. Even the drop of blood at the corner of his chapped lips was compassionate. Her sense of perception was completely controlled, and her psyche power was completely drained. Her body was so weak that she could not even move her fingers. The powerful Tao addict was now weaker than a baby. However, she only looked at the old monk indifferently and did not have any reaction. She knew that she would not be able to escape today. She was so proud that she would not beg for mercy. Even when she felt the pain and disgust from her shoulder, she still remained calm. This was because she did not want Divine Lord Lotus to have the slightest possibility of getting pleasure from it. This was the only resistance that she could do before her death. Your blood is filled with the power of light. It is extremely pure and rich Taoist aura. Even decades ago, I rarely had the chance to taste such power. Master Lotus looked at her beautiful face gently and said with pity, "It is a pity that you are no longer a virgin. The shadow in your Taoist heart has added some impatience to your blood. Otherwise, you could be compared to the pure charm of Xiao Xiao in the past." Upon hearing this, Yi Hongyu's hands that were powerless to support herself on the ground trembled slightly. However, she remained stubborn and cold without saying a word. Suddenly, her pupils shrank slightly. This was because she saw a very strange scene. Master Lotus's face, which was as skinny as a ghost, seemed to be slightly plumper than before. His dry and pale lips seemed to have a tinge of redness, and a surge of vitality was born spontaneously. Yi Hongyu thought of a certain legendary devil's doctrine skill and could not help but feel a chill down her spine. Master Lotus did not look at her anymore. He raised his head and looked at the wetness in the cracks of the roof. Perhaps it was because his vitality was gradually recovering, or perhaps it was because of the fresh blood of the young girl, he could not help but start to recall the glorious and beautiful past. He muttered, when the South Jin Kingdom was newly established, there were beauties dancing in the court. The old and slightly hoarse voice stopped abruptly. He looked at the two people on the ground whose life and death was unknown. Ning Ke was neither dead nor unconscious. He only felt that his body was in extreme pain as if it was falling apart. His consciousness could not control the movements of his body. He understood that it should be because his sense of perception had been severely injured by the old monk's gaze. He used his elbows to support himself on the ground and wanted to climb up. He wanted to draw his bow and arrow again. He wanted to take out the big black umbrella behind him and his 3 knives. However, he could not complete any of his actions. He could only look at the old monk in despair. The old monk had only casually glanced at them and he and the calligraphy addict had been completely defeated. It was really frightening. In the midst of pain and absent-mindedness, Ning Ke remembered that he had once asked his master how a fight in the knowing destiny state was like. At that time, Master Yen Sei had used second brother of the academy as an example. He had said that as long as second brother looked at you, you would die. This old monk, who had been imprisoned in the Bone Mountain for decades, was extremely weak and almost half dead. At this moment, he could reach the pinnacle level of second brother with just a casual glance. Then what kind of horrifying state had this person cultivated to when he was full of spirit and healthy back then? Could it be that he had already transcended the mortal realm and broken through the 5 states? At this moment, the old monk looked at him. He saw the strange changes on the old monk's face and was shocked speechless. He could not understand what was going on. Mo Shanshan had been extremely weak because she had thought too much about breaking the Great Blockage Formation. Previously, when the half-divine talisman was broken by the old monk's gaze, she had been seriously injured. At this moment, looking at the strange changes on Master Lotus's face, her body trembled violently. Her eyes were filled with uncontrollable fear as she said with a trembling voice, "Tao Tai, could it be, could it be? Tao Tai." There was a record in the West Hill Divine Palace's teachings that there was an ancient beast named Tao Tai. It had a head but no body and was greedy for food. There was another record about Tao Tai in the West Hill Divine Palace's teachings. It was an extremely evil skill of the Devil's Doctrine. The powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine who cultivated this skill would devour the flesh and blood of other cultivators to strengthen their aura. They were greedy and murderous. They were the most sinister and evil. Even the people of the Devil's Doctrine were ashamed to be the same as them. The Tao Tai skill that even the Devil's Doctrine despised was undoubtedly one of the evilest skills in the world. Ning Ke had never heard of such a devil's skill. However, the scene of Lotus gently sucking the blood from Yi Hongyu's wound had already shocked him greatly. Later on, Master Lotus' vitality was recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. Connecting the two, he could naturally guess what it meant. Ever since he came to this world, he had seen many cruel things. He had even seen many more horrifying and bloody scenes. He knew that life and death were fated and could be said to be fearless. However, when he thought about how he would be slowly devoured by this old monk who was as skinny as a ghost, the shadow that was left in his heart when he was young suddenly expanded. This caused his face to instantly turn pale and his eyes to be filled with fear. Perhaps it was to overcome the fear in his heart, Ning Ke said to Mo Shanshan who was beside him, don't be afraid of him. He has been trapped for decades and is already at his limit. The previous gaze had already exhausted the psyche power that he had painstakingly accumulated. If he could still fight, he would have killed both of us long ago. He wouldn't even be unable to get rid of the iron chain that pierced through his abdomen. The old monk looked at him and said gently, "Your eyesight is indeed not bad." Since the old monk was temporarily unable to get rid of the iron chain and still needed to use the devil's skill to turn the Tao addict's flesh and blood into his own strength, what Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan had to do now was to race against time to see who could recover faster than the old monk. Ning Ke sat with his legs crossed and closed his eyes. Mo Shanshan retracted her left leg and sat down with great difficulty. The two of them began to meditate at the same time. However, after a while, the two of them opened their eyes in shock and despair. When Master Lotus looked at them, the two of them felt a strong impact on their spirits. This impact even affected their internal organs and their sense of perception was severely injured. At this moment, they could not even enter the usual meditation that they were so familiar with. The two of them looked at each other and chose to give up tacitly. They were prepared to try using the method of talisman Taoism. After all, the psyche power required for talisman Taoism was slightly lesser. However, in the next moment, they realized that even this method could not be used. The qi of heaven and earth in this dark room was so thin that it was almost non-existent. The psyche power required for talisman Taoism was extremely little. However, talisman Taoism was ultimately the use of the qi of heaven and earth. If there was no qi of heaven and earth, what was the use of talisman Taoism? The gentle and compassionate voice of Master Lotus resounded in the room. The white bones as the fence and the dried corpses as the bars are just the appearance. In reality, this confinement is made of green stones as the fence and sword marks as the bars. It was personally set up by Kuharan. Chapter 276. Fresh human flesh was always difficult to chew, especially for an old monk who had lost all his teeth. That was why he chewed very seriously, his skinny cheeks constantly trembling. Compassion and pity, as well as greed and bloodthirstiness, these two completely different emotions, were constantly changing in that pair of eyes that were still as calm as a spring lake. As the flesh that was chewed into a paste was swallowed into his stomach and absorbed, the old monk's sunken eyes gradually brightened. His skinny cheeks gradually filled up and his face that was as withered as a piece of wood gradually revealed a stronger liveliness. The girl's forearm was like a pure white lotus root that had been washed clean by the lake water. Accompanied by a terrifying ripping sound, a piece of flesh was bitten off while she was still alive. Blood flowed down from the wound. Her face was pale, but she pressed her lips together and refused to let out a cry of pain. The old monk stuck out his black tongue and licked the blood off the corner of his lips. He still maintained a compassionate expression on his face. However, the more it was so, the more chilling the contrast was. Ning Ke looked at the scene and felt a chill run down his spine. The development of the situation was too unexpected. Be it him or Yi Hongyu, they had never thought that Master Lotus, who was known for his noble character, would actually be such a terrifying devil. Most importantly, the aura that this old monk exuded was so pure and compassionate. Even if he had some doubts in his heart, he instinctively did not want to suspect this old monk. Master Lotus, who had already swallowed the mouthful of flesh and blood, seemed to have turned back into the highly respected and compassionate Vedanta of the Buddhism sect in an instant. He looked at Yi Hongyu who was under his palm. He saw the despair and hatred in the girl's eyes. He stretched out his finger and slowly slid it across her delicate face. He said pitifully, "You're so cute. How could I do this to you?" Yi Hongyu's sense of perception was controlled and she lost control of her body. However, her consciousness and senses were still sharp. She could clearly feel that she was becoming weaker and weaker. She also felt that the thin finger on her face was as cold and terrifying as a snake's tongue. Why did I do that? Why didn't I resist the temptation of flesh and blood? The old monk's eyes became a little hollow and a little confused. He murmured to himself and suddenly laughed at himself. He shook his head and sighed. At a glance, the two children in the see-through realm are still alive. After decades of condensing such a pitiful amount of psyche power, they have all been used up. Lotus, you are too weak now. His expression became calm again, and he gently explained to himself and the three young people in the room, I've been struggling on the edge of life and death for decades. I could die at any time, so I have to eat something. His explanation sounded normal and natural, but it sounded extremely cold to the ears of Ning Ke and the other two. Ning Ke was now sure that youngest uncle had broken into the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine with a single sword decades ago. But for some reason, he did not kill this person. Instead, he locked him up here with a big inhibition and made him suffer from hunger and loneliness for decades. Decades passed by. No matter how profound and powerful the old monk's realm was, he could not withstand such inhuman torture. Gradually, he was on the verge of death. At this moment, the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine was reopened due to the change in the cycle of time. The three of them accidentally came here and became the old monk's greatest hope of escaping. That was why there were so many discussions about Taoism. The old monk used his Buddha's mercy to make the three gradually lower their guard. Then, he used the great temptation of passing on his mantle to make the Tao addict open up her spiritual world. From then on, they were restrained. Ning Ke frowned and said, regardless of whether it is Master Lotus or Divine Lord Lotus, they both have a supreme reputation in the cultivation world. I have never heard of your name, but these two girls kowtowed to you the moment they saw you. It is obvious that they trust you very much. You can totally wait for us to rescue you. Why do you have to take such a risk? The old monk smiled and said, because you can't break this array. Only I, who have recovered my strength, can break this confinement. And if I want to recover my strength, I have to eat you. Even if we can't break this confinement, our elders in the sect can. The old monk laughed and said, in this world, there are only a handful of people besides me who can break the confinement set by Crazy Ku. There are indeed people among the elders in your sect who can do it. Unfortunately, these people all know the story of what happened in the past and know my secret. If they know that I am still alive, they will definitely not choose to save me. Instead, they will not hesitate to destroy half the world with me in order to kill me and then burn my bones to ashes. Ning Ke was startled and then said, it seems like you are not a likable person. The old monk sighed and continued, after accompanying the corpses for so many years, I have actually given up the hope of leaving. But I did not expect the front gate to be reopened one day. What's more, I did not expect the first batch to enter the front gate to be three cute and pitiful children. I think this is probably fate's arrangement. Ning Ke was silent. He thought to himself that the three addicts in the world and him, a disciple of the second floor of the academy, were probably qualified to stir up a few storms in the cultivation world today. But in the eyes of this powerhouse of the previous generation, they were just three cute and pitiful children. Time was indeed the most important factor for cultivators. The psyche power that I have accumulated over the decades is indeed not much. But from the moment you entered the hall, I started to use the questioning heart skill of the Buddhism sect. I thought that you were the weakest among the three of you and would be the first to enter the illusion. But I did not expect you to be the only one to maintain a clear mind. I am very curious as to how you did it. The old monk looked at him and said with a carefree smile. Although his appearance was still skinny and ugly, his carefree and arrogant aura that looked down on the common people was completely evident. He was like a mad scholar who was holding a wine pot and discussing the Tao. Ning Ke guessed that he should be seizing the time to absorb the blood food in his stomach. But he did not expose him. Instead, he continuously tightened the subtle muscles in his body at a high frequency and replied, "Perhaps the temptation you gave was not enough." The old monk frowned slightly and looked at him. He asked, "Is my mantle not attractive to you?" Ning Ke said with slight mockery, "Of course I yearn for power, but it must be true." The old monk smiled and said, "When Taoism and the devil are interlinked, one can enter the divine state. This is what I have comprehended over the years. I did not lie to you." Ning Ke was slightly startled and said, "But you still need to enter the devil first." The old monk was like a goshawk in the blue sky looking at a chicken in the fence. He looked at him coldly and said, "I have said before that the academy is indeed not as good as the previous generation. You are actually so scared by the words 'enter the devil.'" Ning Ke shook his head and said, "If it is a need before life and death, entering the devil is nothing. But first, I must be willing and not have a heart of doubt. Otherwise, what is the apatheicized God? And since it is a temptation, it must have some weight. The temptation that you showed me with the Buddhist sweet sound is not enough for me." There was contempt and disdain in his words. At this moment, Lotus was not an eminent monk Vedanta, but a chic and even domineering man. He squinted his eyes slightly and said with displeasure and mockery, "Is there anything in the world that is more attractive than my mantle?" Ning Ke suddenly laughed, "I am a disciple of the second floor of the academy. In the future, I will inherit the headmaster's mantle. Even if I enter the devil, I can still learn what youngest uncle left behind. I think this weight should be more important." The old monk was speechless when he heard this. Even if he was so proud that he regarded the three sects of Taoism, Buddhism and the devil as broken shoes, he did not dare to think that he was higher than the headmaster of the academy. As for his lifelong enemy, Xiaofan, he had left him endless humiliation and pain. And I have never met a truly selfless person in my life. I always thought that a bowl of fragrant fried egg noodles would not appear on the table out of nowhere. So the more pitiful and touching you were, the more uncomfortable I felt. Ning Ke continued, "I am very curious about those stories that you told me earlier. Which of them is true? Or are they all ghost stories that you purposely told us to lower our guard?" Those stories had the shadow of youngest uncle's shadow, so he was very concerned. However, the old monk sitting on the bone mountain and the young man sitting on the ground were clearly in a life and death situation. Yet, they had the leisure to gossip about such things. This scene was unavoidably a little strange. The old monk said with a pitiful expression, "Those stories that I told you earlier are all true, but there are some key points that I did not make clear. The massacre of the Lank temple was planned by me. The beautiful dancer was eventually sucked dry by me. Her face was very pale after she died, so pale that it was almost transparent. But strangely, there was still a sweet smile on her pale face, as if she was asking me why I did it." He looked at Ning Ke and said calmly, "At that time, I was very afraid of the smile on her face. I tried to wipe it off with my hands, but I could not. So in the end, I cut her into pieces and ate her. That was also the first time I ate a human." Ning Ke was silent for a long time. Suddenly, he asked, "Who was that dancer?" The old monk smiled and said, "She wanted to turn Xiaofan into a madman. Naturally, it was his woman who died." Ning Ke heard this answer and was silent for a long time. Then, he asked, "Was it to provoke a war between the academy and the divine hall? Or was it for some other reason?" The old monk was silent for a moment. Then, he said expressionlessly, "There was no other reason. It was just that Xiaofan saw through it in the end. And Wei Guangming, that blockhead, somehow began to suspect my identity. I had no choice but to quietly leave the Peach Mountain and return to the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine. Then, these things happened." Listening to the gradually turbid aura, Ning Ke was sure that this once peerless powerhouse was about to die after being imprisoned by youngest uncle for decades. If it was a head-on battle, he would not be a match for the three of them. However, this person had actually set up such a trap in such a short time. He was indeed a meticulous and terrifying person. However, thinking back to decades ago, this person had dominated the Buddhism, Taoism and the Devil's Doctrine. In the end, he had almost caused the whole world to fall into a bloody hell. For someone with such great ability to deal with the three of them was like a butcher knife to a chicken. It was natural that he could easily put them in such a desperate and dangerous situation.